Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a story about ambition and love, about secrets hidden in plain sight, and about how one cold January morning shattered the promise of a bright future. This is the story of Danita Smith, a young woman whose camera captured the world around her, whose dreams were almost within reach, and whose life ended on a stairwell in Durham, North Carolina. As you settle into the quiet darkness, let me take you back to 2007, to a university campus, to a love triangle that turned deadly, and to the question that would haunt two families forever: who really pulled the trigger? Breathe slowly. Listen carefully. This is a story about truth and lies, about the thin line between love and obsession. This is the story of Danita Smith. In the winter of 2007, Danita Monique Smith was 25 years old and standing on the edge of everything she'd worked for. Born in Charlotte, North Carolina, on November 20th, 1981, Danita had grown up with a camera in her hands and a hunger to tell stories that mattered. Her mother, Sharon, remembered her daughter's relationship with photography as something almost spiritual. The camera wasn't just a tool for Danita, it was her language, her way of making sense of the world. Through the lens, she found her voice. At North Carolina Central University in Durham, Danita had built an impressive reputation. She wasn't just another graduate student pursuing a master's degree in mass communications. She was someone people noticed, someone they remembered. Her undergraduate years at NCCU had been filled with achievement after achievement. Staff photographer for the Campus Echo student newspaper from 2001 to 2004. A fellowship at the prestigious New York Times Student Journalism Institute and membership in the Sigma Tau Delta International English Honor Society. But Danita was more than her resume. She played the saxophone in the Sound Machine marching band, her music filling football stadiums on autumn afternoons. She sang with the worship and praise inspirational mass choir, her voice rising in harmony with others. She worked at the writing studio, helping fellow students find the words they couldn't quite grasp on their own. Chancellor James Ammons called her one of the university's academic stars. Her professors spoke of her graceful composure, her kindness, her ability to excel without arrogance. Gerard Farrow, a former arts and entertainment editor at the Campus Echo who worked closely with Danita, would later say that for anyone who knew her, sadness would always hang in the air at her memory. In January 2007, Danita was in the final semester of her graduate program. Her thesis was nearly complete. Graduation was just months away, and with it the launch of a career she'd been building towards since she was young. The photojournalism world was opening its doors to her. And there was something else. Something that made everything feel complete. She was engaged. His name was Jermaine Stroud. And to Danita, he was everything she'd hoped for in a partner. They'd met during their college years at NCCU. And over 6 years, their relationship had deepened into something she believed was unshakable. He was a Greensboro police officer, responsible, dedicated, protective. They'd been engaged since November 2006, just 2 months earlier. Danita's best friend, Edith Kearns, remembered how Danita would gush about Jermaine. Before I even met him, Danita spoke very highly of him, Edith recalled. She said he was a gentleman, intelligent, active, involved, well-rounded, kind. She said he respected her, protected her, loved her. To Danita, Jermaine was her perfect man. She envisioned a future filled with love, marriage, and professional success. She had no idea that the man she loved was living a double life. She had no idea that someone she'd never met was watching her. And she had no idea that she had only days to live. While Danita Smith was planning her wedding and finishing her thesis in Durham, 50 miles away in Greensboro, Another woman believed she had a claim on Jermaire Stroud's heart. Her name was Shannon Elizabeth Crawley. Shannon was 27 years old in January 2007, a single mother of two children, a 10-year-old boy and an 8-year-old girl. She worked as a 911 dispatcher for Guilford Metro 911 in Greensboro, the same city where Jermaire worked as a police officer. That's how they met. Through work, through proximity, through opportunity. According to investigators, their relationship began sometime in 2004, evolving from friendly workplace interactions into something more intimate by late 2004. What started casually turned sexual, and Shannon, it seemed, wanted more than Jermaire was willing to give. During their affair, Shannon became pregnant. The pregnancy forced a reckoning. According to both Shannon and Jermaire's later statements to police, Jermaire made it clear he didn't want to have a child with her. Shannon had an abortion, and shortly after that, Jermaire ended the physical relationship. This was in 2005, roughly a year before Danita's murder. But ending a relationship on paper and ending it in reality are two different things. According to Jermaire, Shannon wouldn't let go. She continued calling him at work. She would show up at his house. She lived just down the street from him, close enough to watch, close enough to know his routines, close enough to see when another woman was in his life. Shannon's co-workers would later tell investigators a different story. They said Jermaire was the one who kept calling Shannon at the dispatch center, sometimes multiple times a day. They described him as controlling, possessive, unable to accept that she'd moved on. Two competing narratives, two different versions of who was pursuing whom, two people, each claiming to be the victim of the other's obsession. But there was one thing both agreed on. Shannon knew about Danita. She knew that Jermaire was engaged to another woman. She knew Danita's name, where she lived, what she looked like. Danita, meanwhile, knew nothing about Shannon Crawley. Jermaire had kept that part of his life completely hidden from her. As far as Danita knew, she was the only woman in Jermaire's life. She had no reason to look over her shoulder. No reason to be afraid. Shannon, however, had reason to be angry. In October 2006, just 3 months before Danita would be killed, Shannon purchased a gun. It was a .38 caliber Taurus special revolver, bought from a coworker named Ronald Simpson. When investigators later asked Shannon why she'd bought the gun, she claimed it was for protection. She said she was afraid of Jermaire, afraid he would hurt her, but she never reported any threats to the police. She never filed a restraining order. She never told her family she was in danger. She just bought a gun and waited. Thursday morning, January 4, 2007, began like any other winter day in Durham. The campus of North Carolina Central University was quiet in the early hours. Students still on holiday break or sleeping off the lingering haze of the New Year's celebrations. At the Campus Crossings apartments on East Cornwallis Road, Danita Smith was preparing to start her day. She lived alone in one of the units, a modest apartment that served as both her home and her creative workspace. Her camera equipment, her thesis materials, her photographs, everything that mattered to her was there. It was cold that morning. The kind of cold that makes you pull your coat tighter as you walk. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Michael Hedgepeth, the maintenance director for Campus Crossings, was making his rounds through the complex. The morning was still quiet, the kind of quiet that makes sudden sounds feel louder than they should be. And then he heard it. A gunshot. Sharp. Unmistakable. Echoing off the buildings. Michael immediately looked toward the O100 building, the direction the sound had come from. That's when he saw a woman running. Not walking, running from the back of the building toward the front. The route she took struck him as unusual. There was a more convenient exit to the parking lot, but she wasn't taking it. She was moving fast, urgently, as if fleeing from something. Michael got in his vehicle and drove toward the building to investigate. As he approached, he saw a young black woman in a burgundy Ford Explorer pulling out of the parking area. The woman appeared hysterical. She was crying, shaking, clearly distressed. Michael stopped her, concerned. He asked what was wrong, if she'd heard the gunshot. The woman told him, yes, she'd heard it. She said she was afraid of guns. She was terrified. She wanted him to stay with her. Michael told her to wait while he called the police to check on the source of the gunfire. But when he turned away to make the call, the woman drove off. Just left. Gone. Michael noted the vehicle burgundy Ford Explorer and the description of the driver. Black female, approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. wearing her hair in a ponytail. Then he went to investigate the building. At first he found nothing. The area seemed clear. But 2 hours later, at approximately 10:00 a.m., another Campus Crossings resident named Corey Smith was leaving his apartment to go to work. As he descended the stairwell of the 1100 building, he noticed something strange. Personal belongings were scattered down the stairs. A purse, a phone, other items strewn as if someone had dropped them in a hurry or a fall. At the bottom of the stairwell, he saw a woman's body. She was lying face down on the concrete sidewalk. Her position suggested she'd fallen or been pushed down the stairs. Corey immediately approached, hoping she was just unconscious, maybe injured from a fall. But when he got close enough, he could see she wasn't breathing. He pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. Following the dispatcher's instructions, he checked the purse on the stairs for identification. Inside, he found a student ID. The woman's name was Danita Monique Smith. When paramedics arrived minutes later, they confirmed what Corey already knew. Danita was dead. Carola Locke, one of the first paramedics on scene, determined that she'd been deceased for some time, likely since shortly after that gunshot. Michael Hedgebeth had heard 2 hours earlier. An autopsy would later reveal the cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Danita had been shot at close range while walking down the stairs. The bullet entered the base of her skull, and she fell forward, tumbling down the concrete steps, her body coming to rest on the sidewalk below. She died almost instantly. She likely never saw her killer's face. Her purse and belongings had spilled down the stairs as she fell. Her phone, still in her hand, had clattered away. Her camera, her future, her wedding plans, all of it ended in a single moment of violence. By noon, word had spread through the NCCU campus. Danita Smith, the photojournalist, the graduate student, the bright star everyone admired, was dead, murdered, and no one knew why. As news of Danita's death spread, her loved ones rushed to the scene. Among them was her fiancé, Jermier Stroud. Jermier arrived at Campus Crossings around midday, visibly shaken. He spoke with Detective Sean Pate, one of the lead investigators assigned to the case. Jermier was grief-stricken, asking questions, demanding answers. Who had done this? Why? Did they have any leads? In homicide investigations, detectives always look closely at the people closest to the victim. Statistically, when a woman is murdered, the perpetrator is often someone she knows. A partner, an ex, a family member. So Detective Pete asked Jermier the question he had to ask. Where were you this morning? Jermier explained that he'd worked the night shift as a police officer in Greensboro, and had come home around 7:00 a.m. to sleep. He said he was alone at his house, about 50 miles away from Durham. He had no alibi, no one to confirm his whereabouts. But he also had no apparent motive. He was engaged to Danita. He seemed genuinely devastated by her death. Detectives noted his statement and allowed him to leave. They spent the rest of the day with his family and Danita's family, comforting them, trying to make sense of the senseless. The next day, January 5, investigators reached out to Jermier again with more specific questions. They asked him about the maintenance workers, description of the woman in the burgundy Ford Explorer. They asked him a question that would change everything. Do you know anyone who drives a burgundy SUV? Without hesitation, Jermier answered, yes, Shannon Crawley, and then the floodgates opened. Jermier admitted to the affair. He told investigators that he and Shannon had been involved from late 2004 into 2005. He told them about the pregnancy, the abortion, the end of the relationship. He told them Shannon lived just down the street from him in Greensboro. He told them she drove a burgundy Ford Explorer. And he told them something else. He said Shannon had been stalking him, that she wouldn't leave him alone, that she called him constantly at work, showed up at his house, watched him. He said he tried to end things, but she wouldn't accept it. He said she knew about Danita, knew they were engaged. He said Shannon had been carrying a gun. Detectives immediately drove to Greensboro to speak with Shannon Crowley. They found her at the Guilford Metro 911 dispatch center, where she worked. At first, Shannon seemed cooperative. She agreed to speak with them. She told investigators she'd been at home in Greensboro that morning, taking one of her children to a pediatrician appointment. She said she had nothing to do with Danita's death. She admitted she knew Jermier, but claimed their relationship had ended long ago. She said she had no reason to harm Danita. She didn't even know her. As the interview was wrapping up, one of Shannon's co-workers approached Detective Pete and slipped him a note. The note said that someone else wanted to speak with him. Someone who had information about Shannon and Jermier. That co-worker told Pete that Jermier had been calling Shannon at the dispatch center constantly for months. Multiple times a day, sometimes 10 times in a single day. The co-worker described Jermier as controlling, obsessive, unable to let go. This contradicted Jermier's claim that Shannon was the one who wouldn't leave him alone. Then the co-worker revealed something even more damning. In October 2006, just 3 months before Danita's murder, he'd sold Shannon a gun, a .38 caliber Taurus special revolver. Detective Pete asked Shannon about the gun. At first she denied owning one. When confronted with the fact that her coworker had sold it to her, she changed her story. She admitted buying the gun, but claimed she'd thrown it away shortly after receiving it. Tossed it in a dumpster along with the ammunition. Detectives didn't believe her. Over the following days, investigators worked quickly to build their case. They obtained Shannon's phone records, her vehicle records, and began tracking her movements on the morning of January 4. What they found was damning. Shannon had told police she was in Greensboro all morning, taking her child to the doctor. But when detectives contacted the pediatrician's office, they learned that Shannon had never shown up for the appointment. She'd canceled or simply hadn't attended. Cell phone tower data painted an even clearer picture. Shannon's phone had pinged off towers in Durham, 60 miles from her home around the time of the murder. The phone data placed her in the vicinity of Campus Crossings apartments when Danita was shot. Jermier's phone records, by contrast, showed his phone had remained in Greensboro all morning, consistent with his claim that he'd been sleeping at home. Forensic analysis of the bullet recovered from Danita's body revealed it came from a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun Shannon had purchased 3 months earlier. Ballistics experts identified 8 possible firearms that could have fired the fatal shot, including a Taurus, the exact make Shannon had bought. When forensic technicians examined Shannon's Ford Explorer, they found gunshot residue on the steering wheel. On January 9, 2007, 5 days after Danita's murder, Durham police arrested Shannon Elizabeth Crawley and charged her with first-degree murder. Shannon was taken into custody, booked, and held without bond. Her arrest sent shockwaves through Greensboro. She was a 911 dispatcher, a single mother of 2 young children. To those who knew her, the idea that she could murder someone seemed impossible, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. Her bail was eventually set at $175,000. 4 months after her arrest, Shannon posted bail and was released while awaiting trial. Her case wouldn't go to trial for another 3 years. And during those 3 years, Shannon would make increasingly desperate attempts to shift blame onto the one person she claimed was truly responsible for Danita's death, Jermier Stroud. By the time Shannon Crawley's trial began in February 2010, more than 3 years had passed since Danita Smith's murder. The case had been delayed twice, and public interest remained intense. Shannon's defense attorney, C. Scott Holmes, built his strategy around a single claim. Jermier Stroud killed Danita Smith, not Shannon Crawley, according to Shannon's version of events. Told to police 5 months after her arrest in May 2007, Jermier had broken into her home on January 3, the day before the murder. She claimed he was armed, threatened her, and forced her to drive with him to Durham, to Campus Crossings. She said they drove around the complex, scouting it out before returning to Greensboro. The next morning, Shannon claimed the same thing happened. Jermier allegedly forced his way into her home again, threatened her children, and demanded she drive him back to Durham. She said he hid in the back of her SUV as they drove. When they arrived at Campus Crossings, Jermier allegedly got out of the vehicle and approached Danita as she was walking down the stairs. Shannon claimed she heard arguing, then a gunshot. She said Jermier ran back to the vehicle, jumped in the back, and forced her to drive away. She said he was hiding in the back seat, crouched down, when she encountered Michael Hedgepeth, the maintenance worker. That's why, she claimed, Hedgepeth didn't see anyone else in the vehicle. It was an elaborate story, but prosecutors argued it was just that, a story, and a poorly constructed one at that. Durham County Chief Assistant District Attorney David Sachs methodically dismantled Shannon's defense. He pointed out that Shannon had waited 5 months after her arrest to tell this story to police. 5 months. If Jermier had truly threatened her, held her at gunpoint, forced her to participate in a murder, why hadn't she told police immediately? Why had she initially lied about owning a gun? Why had she lied about her whereabouts that morning? Agent Sachs presented the phone records showing Shannon's phone in Durham and Jermier's phone in Greensboro. He presented the forensic evidence, the gunshot residue on Shannon's steering wheel, the ballistics evidence linking the bullet to a gun like the one Shannon had purchased. He presented testimony from Shannon's co-worker, Ronald Simpson, who confirmed he'd sold Shannon the P38 Taurus revolver in October 2006. Just 3 months before the murder, Shannon had initially denied owning a gun, then claimed she'd thrown it away, but no gun was ever found. Jermier Stroud owned 2 weapons, a .40 caliber Sig Sauer and a .40 caliber Glock 23. Forensic experts testified that a .40 caliber weapon cannot fire a .38 caliber bullet. The bullet that killed Danita came from a .38 caliber revolver. The same type of gun Shannon had purchased and then couldn't account for. Sachs presented testimony from Shannon's co-workers, who described her behavior in the days after the murder. She seemed calm and unaffected. She came to work. She functioned normally. She showed no signs of trauma, no signs of fear. If she'd truly been threatened, held hostage, forced to participate in a murder, wouldn't she have been terrified? Wouldn't she have shown some sign of distress? But perhaps the most damaging evidence came from Shannon herself. During the trial, the defense played audio recordings Shannon had made of what she claimed were phone conversations with Jermier. In these recordings, a male voice, supposedly Jermier's, whispered confessions. The voice admitted to killing Danita. The voice said he couldn't go to prison. But the voice didn't sound like Jermier. Even Shannon's own attorney, Scott Holmes, acknowledged the tapes were problematic. "It's pretty convenient," Holmes said in court. "That didn't sound like the Jermier who took the stand, did it? That sounded like Michael Jackson or something." Prosecutors argued the recordings were fabricated. They pointed out that the confessions on the tapes matched Shannon's story exactly. It seemed as though someone was reading from a script. When Jermier took the stand, he denied everything. He denied forcing Shannon to drive to Durham. He denied killing Danita. He denied making the phone calls Shannon claimed to have recorded. Shannon also took the stand in her own defense. She testified about the alleged abuse, the threats, the fear she lived in. She cried. She pleaded with the jury to believe her, but the jury didn't. After deliberating for approximately 7 hours over 2 days, the jury returned with their verdict on February 22nd, 2010. Guilty of first-degree murder. Shannon showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Judge Ronald Stevens immediately sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the courtroom, Danita's mother, Sharon Smith, addressed Shannon directly. "Because of what you did, there is a void. You took her away from me. Someday I may forgive you, but right now I don't. And I hope you rot in hell. You're vile. You don't deserve to be a mother." Shannon's parents, however, remained convinced of their daughter's innocence. Her father, Keith Crowley, vowed to continue fighting. "If it is the last thing I ever do, I will prove that he is the one that actually committed that crime. I won't rest and I won't stop until he's where he belongs, in jail." Even Judge Stevens, who had presided over the trial and upheld the jury's verdict, seemed troubled by the broader circumstances of the case. As he sentenced Shannon, he said, "Jermier Stroud caused a perfect storm to happen and then walked away from it. And that was unfortunate for everyone in this case." Shannon's attempts to implicate Jermier didn't end with her conviction. In June 2008, while Shannon was out on bail awaiting trial, she made a shocking allegation to Charlotte police. She claimed that Jermier had come to Charlotte in the early morning hours, found her walking her dog near her family's home, and violently attacked her. She alleged that Jermier had held a knife to her throat, cut off her clothes, cut her thigh, and sexually assaulted her over a period of several hours from approximately 2:30 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. Police took the accusation seriously and launched an immediate investigation. A sexual assault unit, Detective Pamela Zenkin, interviewed Shannon and ordered a forensic examination. But the investigation quickly unraveled. A medical examination found no physical evidence of sexual assault. No semen was recovered. The injuries Shannon claimed to have sustained were not consistent with her story. More critically, investigators obtained Jermaire's cell phone records for the time in question. The records showed that based on the timeline Shannon provided in the location data from Jermaire's phone, he would have had to travel from Charlotte to Greensboro at approximately 120 miles per hour, without stopping for a single red light to have committed the assault, and then returned home in time for the phone data to place him in Greensboro. It was physically impossible. Investigators also found surveillance footage that accounted for Jermaire's whereabouts that morning. He had not been in Charlotte. Shannon had lied. Again, the false rape accusation only served to further damage Shannon's credibility. Prosecutors argued it demonstrated a pattern. Shannon was willing to fabricate elaborate stories to frame Jermaire for crimes he didn't commit. Shannon Elizabeth Crawley is currently serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. She continues to maintain her innocence, insisting that Jermaire Stroud is the one who murdered Danita Smith. She filed an appeal in 2010, challenging her conviction on multiple grounds. The North Carolina Court of Appeals denied her appeal in 2011, upholding the jury's verdict and the trial court's rulings. Jermaire Stroud was never charged with any crime in connection with Danita's death. The Greensboro Police Department conducted a thorough investigation and found no evidence linking him to the murder. Chief Tim Bellamy stated publicly that Jermaire was never a suspect, and that no allegations against him surfaced until Shannon's defense raised them at trial. According to some reports, Jermaire remarried less than a year after Danita's death, though this has not been independently confirmed. He declined to be interviewed for Dateline NBC's coverage of the case, but did provide a statement denying any involvement in Danita's murder and refuting all of Shannon's allegations. For Danita's family, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring their daughter back. Danita's father, Calvin Smith, said after the verdict, "I was thankful to God for the guilty verdict, because I was glad that Danita didn't get murdered twice." Her mother, Sharon, continues to mourn the daughter she lost. The photographer, the scholar, the kind young woman with so much promise. North Carolina Central University honored Danita's memory by naming the student newspaper's newsroom the Danita Smith Newsroom. Her photograph hangs on the wall, a reminder of the talent and passion she brought to her work. A picture of Danita remains taped to the wall outside the newsroom. Students pass it every day, many of them never having met her, but all of them aware of her legacy. Even now, nearly 2 decades after Danita Smith's murder, questions linger. Did Shannon act alone, or was she telling the truth about Jermaire's involvement? The evidence overwhelmingly points to Shannon as the shooter. The cell phone data, the gunshot residue, the gun purchase, the false alibi, all of it implicates her. And yet Shannon's family remains convinced she was framed. What role, if any, did Jermaire play in the tragedy? Even the judge who sentenced Shannon acknowledged that Jermaire's actions, his affair with Shannon, his engagement to Danita, his failure to fully end the relationship with Shannon, created a perfect storm. He may not have pulled the trigger, but his choices set events in motion. Could Danita's death have been prevented? If Jermaire had been honest with Danita about his past with Shannon, would Danita have taken precautions? Would she have known to be wary of a burgundy Ford Explorer in the parking lot? These are the questions families ask themselves in the aftermath of violence. The what-ifs, the if-onlys, but there are no good answers. Only the silence of a young woman who will never graduate, never marry, never fulfill the promise everyone saw in her. In the end, the story of Danita Smith is a story about the fragility of life, about how one person's jealousy, one moment of rage, one pull of a trigger can end a universe of possibility. Danita was 25 years old. She had a camera that captured light and shadow. She had a thesis nearly finished. She had a wedding to plan. She had her whole life ahead of her. And on a cold January morning, as she walked down a stairwell with her purse in her hand, someone took all of that away. Shannon Crawley sits in prison, maintaining her innocence, insisting the real killer walks free. Jermaire Stroud lives his life, carrying the weight of his choices, whatever role they played in the tragedy. And Danita's family carries on without her, visiting her grave in Charlotte, remembering the daughter who loved photography, who dreamed big, who deserved so much more than she got. As you drift towards sleep tonight, remember Danita Monique Smith. Remember her not for how she died, but for how she lived with grace, with ambition, with a camera that captured the world as she saw it, full of light, full of possibility, full of beauty. May Danita rest in peace. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that shook a quiet city in North Dakota and ultimately sparked national change. This is a story about hope and heartbreak, about a young woman preparing for motherhood, and about the darkness that can hide behind a neighbor's door. It was the summer of 2017 in Fargo, North Dakota, a city where prairie winds sweep across flat horizons and neighbors know each other by name. In a modest apartment building on 9th Street North, 22-year-old Savannah LaFontaine Graywind was counting down the days to one of life's most precious moments. She was 8 months pregnant, her due date set for September 20th, and every part of her life seemed to be falling into perfect place. Savannah was a member of the Spirit Lake Sioux tribe, born in Belcourt and raised with deep connections to her native heritage. Her Dakota name, Where Thunder Finds Her, carried the strength of her ancestors, though those who knew her would tell you she was gentle, soft-spoken, with a quick smile and an easy laugh. She had long, straight brown hair that fell past her shoulders, bright green eyes that sparkled when she talked about the future, and a constellation of freckles across her cheeks that made her look younger than her years. After graduating from Warwick High School in 2013, Savannah had pursued her passion for caring for others. She earned her certification as a nursing assistant and found work at Eventide, a senior living facility in Fargo. Her coworkers and the residents adored her. She had that rare quality of making people feel seen, of listening not just with her ears but with her whole heart. The elderly men and women in her care would light up when she entered their rooms. She had plans too, dreams of going back to school to become a registered nurse, of building a career in elder care where she could make a real difference in people's lives. But more than anything that summer, Savannah was focused on becoming a mother. She and her boyfriend Ashton Nathany had been together since her freshman year of high school, nearly 7 years of young love that had weathered the storms of growing up. Ashton was also a member of the Spirit Lake tribe, a young man with his own dreams and his own quiet determination. He had been working construction in Minneapolis, but as Savannah's pregnancy progressed, he couldn't bear to be so far away. He quit his job and moved back to North Dakota in June, staying with his father on the reservation near Devil's Lake so he could be close when their baby arrived. He had already chosen a name, Heisley Joe. They'd rented an apartment together across from McKinley Park, just a short walk from where Savannah was staying temporarily with her parents. They were painting a nursery in their minds, picking out baby clothes, imagining what it would be like to hold their daughter for the first time. Savannah told everyone who would listen how excited she was. She'd helped raise her niece and nephew, Odessa and Shane Jr., and those children had been such a huge part of her life that motherhood felt like her calling. For now, though, she was living in the basement apartment at 2825 9th Street North, with her mother Norberta, her father Joe, and her siblings. It was temporary, practical, a place to be surrounded by family in these final weeks before the baby came. The apartment building itself was unremarkable, a 3-story structure in a quiet neighborhood where children played in yards and people walked their dogs in the evening light. On the 3rd floor, directly above the Graywind family, lived a couple that Savannah had come to know in passing. Brooke Cruz was 38 years old. Her boyfriend William Hohen, 32. They'd been together since around 2014, and from the outside they seemed like just another couple trying to make it work. But behind their doors something was deeply, terribly wrong. Brooke Lynn Cruz had lived a life marked by instability and reinvention. Born Brooke Doolin in Bradenton, Florida, she'd become a mother while still practically a child herself. By age 15 she already had a baby, and by the time she was in her late teens she'd bounced through relationships and living situations with a restlessness that never quite settled. Those who knew her from her younger years described a woman with a fierce temper but not necessarily a violent one. someone who seemed to be running from something, though perhaps even she couldn't name what it was. She'd studied psychology at Minnesota State University. Moorhead had harbored dreams of being a writer. On her Facebook page, she posted quotes about freedom and not caring what others thought. But beneath that projected confidence was something more fragile, more desperate. By the time she met William Hone on a bus in 2012, she was searching for something to anchor her. William Hone came with his own troubled history. Court records painted a picture of a man who'd struggled since adolescence. Someone who'd actually sued his own parents for child support when he was 16. In 2011, he'd been convicted of child abuse after his infant son was found with skull fractures at a Grand Forks hospital. The relationship between Hone and Cruz was volatile from the start. Police reports documented their fights in May 2016. Hone threw Cruz into a bathtub during an argument, leading to an assault charge and a no-contact order. 6 months later, police found them together again, and Hone pleaded guilty to violating that order. They cycled through breakups and reconciliations, their relationship fueled by drugs, alcohol, and a codependency that neither seemed able to break. And when they broke up in early 2017, Cruz made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events too horrible to fully comprehend. She told Holding she was pregnant. She wanted him back, needed him back, and in her desperation she constructed an elaborate lie. She sent him photographs, an old sonogram from one of her previous pregnancies, a positive pregnancy test she'd saved. She found a recording of a baby's heartbeat online and played it for him over the phone. She kept a journal, documenting fake symptoms, appetite changes, leg swelling, weight gain, even contractions. She convinced not only Holding but somehow even herself, journaling daily about a pregnancy that existed only in her imagination. For months, the deception worked. Hone came back to her. They moved into apartment 5 together, the third-floor unit in the building where the Graywind family lived below. But delusions, no matter how carefully maintained, cannot withstand reality forever. In early August, the fantasy began to crumble. Hone started to question whether Cruz was really pregnant. He told his coworkers, told his friends, told people at their apartment building. The pressure mounted. According to Cruz's later testimony, Hone told her point blank that he didn't believe she was pregnant anymore, and that she needed to produce a baby. She took it as an ultimatum: get a baby, or lose him forever. That's when Cruz noticed her downstairs neighbor, Savannah, heavy with her own very real pregnancy, and in Brooke Cruz's fractured mind, a plan began to form. Saturday, August 19th, 2017, started like any late summer day in Fargo. The morning sun filtered through windows, and the heat of the season hung in the air with that particular quality of August, heavy and golden and fading. Savannah spent the morning at home with her family, moving through the apartment with the careful waddle of a woman in her 3rd trimester. Her baby was due in just over a month, and she could feel Heisley Joe moving inside her, stretching and turning, preparing for her entrance into the world. Around lunchtime, Savannah decided to order pizza for the family. She sent a text to her mother, letting her know the food would be arriving soon. It was one of those small domestic moments that would later become unbearably precious. A daughter thinking of her family, making sure everyone would have something to eat. It was sometime in the early afternoon when Brooke Cruz came downstairs and knocked on the Graywind family's door. She had a proposition, she said. She was working on a sewing project, a dress, and she needed someone to model it so she could pin the fabric and adjust the fit. She was willing to pay $20. For Savannah, who was saving every penny for the baby. It seemed like an easy way to earn a little extra money. She could use it for baby clothes, for the nursery she and Ashton were preparing. She texted her mother just before she went upstairs, telling her what she was doing. At 1:40 in the afternoon, she sent a text to Ashton, who was house-sitting for his mother in Grand Forks. It was the last message he would ever receive from her. The last contact, the last proof that she was still alive and still herself. Upstairs in apartment 5, Savannah found Brooke waiting. There was sewing equipment visible, evidence of the project Cruz had described. But what happened next remains disputed in its exact details, filtered through the conflicting testimonies of 2 people with every reason to reshape the truth. What is certain is that within a short time of entering that apartment, Savannah Graywind would never leave it alive. According to Brooke Cruz's testimony, she picked a fight almost immediately. She accused Savannah of throwing her cat, of stealing her mail, trivial accusations designed to provoke A physical altercation began. Cruz claimed she pushed Savannah, that the young woman fell and struck her head on the bathroom sink, knocking her unconscious. But the medical examiner who would later examine Savannah's body found no evidence of head trauma, nothing to support that version of events. What is undeniable is what came next. Brooke Cruz took a knife from a kitchen drawer and brought Savannah into the bathroom. And there, in that small, ordinary bathroom in an ordinary apartment building on an ordinary Saturday afternoon, she did the unthinkable. She cut into Savannah's abdomen and performed a crude cesarean section, reaching into the young woman's body and pulling out her baby girl. Savannah was conscious, at least partially, during this violation. She was in and out of awareness as her body was opened, as her child was taken from her. The horror of those moments defies comprehension. The pain, the terror, the realization of what was happening. Medical examiners would later struggle to determine whether she died from blood loss or from what came after. But in that bathroom, Savannah Graywin's life was being stolen along with her child. William Hone arrived home from work shortly after the baby was removed. According to Cruz, he opened the bathroom door and saw the scene. Savannah bleeding on the floor, a newborn baby in a mixing bowl wrapped in towels, Cruz covered in blood. His reaction, by Cruz's account, was not horror or a call to the police. Instead, she testified. He asked if Savannah was dead. And when Cruz said she didn't know, that she needed help, Hone allegedly left the room and returned wearing only his underwear and carrying a rope. Cruz claimed that Hone wrapped the rope around Savannah's neck and pulled it tight, saying, "If she wasn't dead before, she is now." Hone would later deny this version of events, claiming he came home to find Savannah already dead, with a rope already around her neck. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy called it an unusual case with two competitive causes of death, unable to definitively determine whether strangulation or blood loss ultimately ended Savannah's life. But the cause of death in the end matters less than the fact itself. Savannah Graywin, 22 years old, with her whole life ahead of her and her daughter about to be born, was murdered in that bathroom. And her killers, rather than calling for help or turning themselves in, began the work of covering up their crime. When Savannah didn't come back downstairs, her mother Norberta began to worry immediately. Savannah's car was still in the driveway. Her wallet was still in the apartment. Her phone was on, ringing when Norberta called. But Savannah wasn't answering. For a young woman 8 months pregnant who had only gone upstairs to help a neighbor with a quick sewing project, her absence made no sense. Norberta called Ashton in Grand Forks, but he hadn't heard from Savannah since that text at 1:24. Norberta's worry turned to dread. She went upstairs herself and knocked on Brooke Cruz's door. Cruz answered. Calm and cooperative, she told Norberta that Savannah had left around 2:30 that afternoon, that she'd helped with the sewing and then gone on her way. But Norberta didn't believe it. She told her family later that she'd never trusted Cruz, that just 2 weeks earlier the woman had knocked on their door asking Savannah to come upstairs and smoke marijuana with her, despite the fact that Savannah was very obviously pregnant. At 4 in the afternoon, the Graywin family called the Fargo police to report Savannah missing. 3 officers arrived at 4:27, spoke with the family, and then went upstairs to question Cruz and Hahn. Both were home. Both were cooperative. Cruz invited the officers inside apartment 5, gave them permission to look around. They saw evidence of the sewing project. They saw nothing suspicious. They found nothing to suggest that anything had happened there just hours earlier. What the police didn't know, what they couldn't have known during that consensual search, was that as they walked through the apartment, Savannah's body was hidden in the bathroom closet, wrapped and concealed, and the baby, tiny newborn Heisley Joe, was covered with a blanket on the bed next to William Hone. The officers saw a man lying on a bed. They had no reason to look under the covers, no cause to open closets without permission. The police returned that same night at about 10:30 for another consensual search. Again, they found nothing. Again, Savannah's body remained hidden in the bathroom closet, mere feet from where they stood. Again, the baby was there in plain sight, concealed among bedding. Sunday morning came, and the Graywin family's panic intensified. Savannah had now been missing for more than 12 hours. She hadn't called. She hadn't reached out. A young woman 8 months pregnant had simply vanished from a building where her family was desperately trying to find her. Police conducted a third consensual search on Sunday, August 20th. By this point, Hone and Cruz had moved Savannah's body from the bathroom closet. Hone had taken one of his dressers, removed all the drawers, and created a hollow space inside. They wrapped Savannah's body in towels and garbage bags and placed it inside this makeshift coffin, then nailed the drawer faces back on to make it look like a normal piece of furniture. When police walked through apartment 5 for the third time, they were standing in a room that contained Savannah's hidden body. The dresser sat there, looking like nothing more than a piece of bedroom furniture. But police were beginning to develop suspicions. They'd learned from neighbors that they'd heard loud noises coming from the bathroom of apartment 5 on Saturday afternoon. Banging sounds, running water. The couple living directly below Cruz and Hohen told investigators they'd heard what sounded like someone being thrown into a bathtub, followed by the shower running. They were so accustomed to Hohen and Cruz fighting that they hadn't thought much of it at the time. Police also discovered something else. Hohen had been telling coworkers and friends that he and Cruz had just had a baby. He was talking about it openly, proudly, as if he'd just become a father. In the early morning hours of Monday, August 21st, Brooke Cruz and William Hohen carried that dresser down the stairs of their apartment building. They loaded it into their Jeep Cherokee and drove to a bridge over the Red River in North Fargo. There, under cover of darkness, they dumped Savannah's body into the water. The dresser, heavy with its terrible cargo, splashed into the river and sank. The current caught it, began to carry it downstream. Back at the apartment, Cruz and Hohen kept Heisley Joe. They decided on a name for her, Phoenix. Hohen continued telling people they'd had a baby, and Cruz played along. They went about their lives as if they were a new family, as if the infant girl they were caring for had come into the world through any normal means. On Wednesday, August 23rd, the couple took the baby with them on a late-night trip to Walmart. Cruz carried Heisley Joe through the store, bought diapers and formula, acted like any other new parent stocking up on supplies. But when they were leaving the parking lot, Hohen backed their vehicle into another car. It was a minor accident, barely worth noting, except that it drew police attention to them once again. Officers ran Hohen's information and discovered he had an outstanding warrant for an unpaid fine. The next day, Thursday, August 24th, police arrested him when he arrived home. Cruz, carrying the baby in a bag, watched as they took her boyfriend away. She thought. She would later testify that they were caught. She believed the police knew everything, but they didn't. Not yet. Owen was able to bail out after being questioned. But investigators were finally putting the pieces together. A neighbor couple claiming to have a newborn baby, but with no record of the woman being pregnant or giving birth at any hospital. A missing pregnant woman. Loud noises from their bathroom. A recent purchase of newborn diapers. It was enough for a search warrant. On Thursday afternoon, August 24th, police executed that warrant on apartment 5. This time they could open every drawer, look in every closet, search every corner, and this time they found what they were looking for, though not the person they were searching for. There on a bed in the apartment, nestled among pillows and blankets, was a newborn baby girl. She was tiny, 4 pounds, 13 ounces. She was healthy. She was alive, and she was, they would soon confirm through DNA testing, the daughter of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind and Ashton Matheny. Cruz was arrested immediately. Hohen, who was by this time being followed by police, was arrested at his workplace. The baby was rushed by ambulance to Sanford Children's Hospital, where doctors examined her with careful hands and astonished hearts. Against all odds, despite the trauma of her birth and the days she'd spent in the care of her mother's killers, Heisley Joe was in remarkably good health, but Savannah herself remained missing. For 3 more days, the search continued. Police and hundreds of volunteers scoured Fargo and the surrounding areas. They searched buildings, dumpsters, vacant lots, cornfields. Police Chief David Todd held press conferences, pleading with the public to check their properties, their garages, their outbuildings. The Fargo community rallied. The Native American Commission held their annual picnic, and with the family's blessing, transformed it into a march through the city. More than 400 people gathered on Saturday, August 26th, to honor Savannah and demand answers. The Spirit Lake tribe mobilized. Volunteers in green shirts spread out across multiple search sites near Trollwood Park. They searched along the Red River's banks, through the fields. Anywhere that might yield a clue. The case had captured national attention. A pregnant Native woman vanishing from her home, her baby found alive with her neighbor, the mother still unaccounted for. It spoke to something larger, something that indigenous communities had been shouting about for years. Native women were disappearing and being murdered at rates far exceeding those of any other demographic, and their cases too often went uninvestigated, unreported, forgotten. Kayakers found her on Sunday evening, August 27th. They were on the Red River near Harwood, just north of Fargo, when they spotted something caught on a fallen log in the water. At 8:20 in the evening, they reported what they'd found. By 9:20, police had confirmed what the Greywind family had known in their hearts for days. It was Savannah. Her body had been wrapped in plastic bags and duct tape, secured so thoroughly that the materials had kept her from sinking. The current had carried her north from where Hone had dumped the dresser, and she'd become snagged on that log, suspended in the water that marked the border between North Dakota and Minnesota. The same river where, years before, 15-year-old Tina Fontaine, another indigenous girl, had been found weighted down by rocks. The Red River had become, in the eyes of many indigenous families, a place where their daughters were discarded, where violence against Native women literally washed downstream while the world looked away. Brooke Cruz and William Hone were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and providing false information to law enforcement. The baby Heisley Joe was placed in protective custody with Cass County Social Services. While DNA tests were conducted to confirm what everyone already knew, she was Savannah's daughter. For Ashton Matheny, those days of waiting were torture. His girlfriend was dead, murdered in a way that defied comprehension. His daughter was alive but held by the state. He hadn't been allowed to see her, to hold her, to even know if she was truly okay. He stayed in Fargo, living with family, waiting for the moment when he could finally meet the child he and Savannah had dreamed about together. On September 4th, 11 days after Heisley Joe was found, Ashton got to hold his daughter for the first time. He was allowed a 90-minute visit at the hospital. He looked at her tiny face and saw Savannah. The same features, the same resemblance to Savannah's baby pictures. He wept. Savannah's parents, Norberta and Joe, got to meet their granddaughter the next day. On September 11th, the DNA results came back officially. Heisley Joe was indeed the daughter of Savannah LaFontaine Greywind and Ashton Matheny. The judge awarded full custody to Ashton. He stood in the courtroom crying again, but this time with tears of joy. It was a great day, he told reporters afterward. I actually started crying in the courtroom. Tears of joy. I was waiting for this day. Heisley Joe had been given a Native American name that translated meant survivor. It fit. Against odds, that should have been impossible. She had survived. In December 2017, Brooke Cruz pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and providing false information to police. On February 2nd, 2018, she stood before Judge Frank Rasek for sentencing. The courtroom was packed with Savannah's family members, all wearing red, the color that has come to symbolize missing and murdered indigenous women. The Norberta Greywind, Savannah's mother, gave a victim impact statement. She wore earrings with her daughter's image. She spoke of the unbearable pain of losing a child, of the horror of learning exactly how her daughter died and how her granddaughter was taken. I get so upset and angry and can't understand how or why these people could have taken my girl from me. From us, she said. The pain of losing a child is like no other pain. I now know that pain. My heart is literally broken. Savannah's father, Joe, spoke of trying to protect his family and failing to protect his daughter from the neighbor living right above them. Ashton sat in the courtroom holding 5-month-old Heisley Joe, his jaw tight, fighting to contain his grief and rage. When Cruz was given a chance to speak, she apologized. I am guilty and I deserve every year I get, she said through tears. I just wanted them to know that I am sorry for what I did. Judge Rasek sentenced Brooke Cruz to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Ashton walked out shaking his head, not looking back. Outside the courthouse, he thanked the judge for showing no leniency. By far the hardest thing I've ever done, he said. By far, I hope no one else in this community, in the United States, in the world, ever has to endure the pain that I do, that the Greywinds have too. William Hone's case was more complex. He maintained that he hadn't known about Cruz's plan, that he'd come home to find a bloody scene, and made the terrible decision to help cover it up rather than call police. In September 2018, he went to trial on the conspiracy to commit murder charge. Brooke Cruz testified against him, describing their troubled relationship, the fake pregnancy, the ultimatum she believed he'd given her to produce a baby. She testified that Hohen had strangled Savannah to ensure she was dead, that he'd taken charge of hiding the body and disposing of it. Hohen denied strangling Savannah, claiming he'd found her already dead with a rope around her neck. The jury acquitted Hohen of conspiracy to commit murder, but convicted him on the lesser charges. He was originally sentenced to life in prison, but successfully appealed and was resentenced in October 2019 to 20 years behind bars. For many in the Native American community, Hohen's reduced sentence felt like yet another instance of justice failing indigenous victims. But regardless of the specific sentences, two facts remained immutable. Savannah Greywind was dead, and Heisley Jo would grow up without her mother. Heisley Jo is being raised by her father, Ashton Matheny, surrounded by her maternal and paternal families. She spends time with her grandparents, Jo and Norberta Greywind, who post photos of her on a public Facebook group dedicated to Savannah's memory. In those images you can see a little girl who is loved fiercely, protected by everyone who couldn't protect her mother. Every day I'm reminded of her more and more, because every day she grows and she's starting to look more like her mother. Ashton said in the months following Savannah's death, "I miss Savannah so much. I've never put love into someone like I did her." Gloria Allred, the high-profile attorney who came to represent the Greywind family, has called Heisley Jo a miracle child, a reminder of both the preciousness of life and the urgent need to protect indigenous women and girls. The apartment building on 9th Street North, where so much tragedy unfolded, stands as it did before. The memorials that once covered its walls are gone. The windows that were boarded up have been repaired. Life in its way goes on, but for those who knew what happened there, the building will forever be marked by Savannah's absence. Savannah's murder sparked something larger than grief, though grief was certainly its foundation. Just weeks after her death, former U.S. Senator Heidi Heitkamp of North Dakota introduced legislation named in Savannah's honor. The bill was called Savannah's Act, and its purpose was to address a crisis that had been ignored for far too long: the epidemic of missing and murdered indigenous women. The statistics are staggering. Native American women are murdered at rates 10 times the national average. According to the National Institute of Justice, 84% of indigenous women experience violence in their lifetimes, and 56% experience sexual violence. And perhaps most telling, an overwhelming 97% of indigenous women who experience violence are victimized by non-native perpetrators. For generations, these women and girls have disappeared into a void of indifference. Their cases go unreported by media, uninvestigated by law enforcement, unresolved by a justice system that has historically failed to protect Native communities. The reasons are complex: jurisdictional gaps between tribal, state, and federal law enforcement, a lack of communication and coordination between agencies, insufficient access to databases and resources, and a systemic devaluation of indigenous lives that has roots going back centuries. Savannah's Act aimed to change that. It proposed improving data collection on missing and murdered indigenous people, clarifying the responsibilities of tribal, federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, increasing communication between these agencies, and providing tribes with better access to federal crime databases. It directed the Department of Justice to develop protocols and guidelines for responding to cases involving missing or murdered Native Americans and required annual reports to Congress on these cases. The bill passed the Senate unanimously in December 2018, but it was blocked in the House by then Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlaw. The legislation sat in limbo through the government shutdown. Reintroduced in 2019, debated and refined and fought for by indigenous advocates, tribal leaders, and lawmakers who refused to let Savannah's name be forgotten. On October 10, 2020, Savannah's Act was finally signed into law by President Donald Trump, along with a companion bill called the Not Invisible Act. After 3 years of advocacy and persistence, federal law finally acknowledged what Native communities had been saying all along. Indigenous women matter, their disappearances matter, their murders matter, and the government has a responsibility to act. Missing and murdered indigenous women are no longer invisible, Senator Heitkamp said when the bill became law. The groundswell of support had exceeded anything she'd imagined, but laws, even good ones, are only as effective as their implementation. The crisis continues. Native women are still going missing. Native women are still being murdered. And while Savannah's Act represents a crucial first step, there is so much more work to be done. Savannah's family has dedicated themselves to that work. They speak at events, participate in marches for missing and murdered Indigenous women, keep Savannah's story alive so that her death might prevent others. They wear red, the color of the movement. They chant, "No more stolen sisters." They refuse to let the world forget. Because remembering Savannah means more than just commemorating a tragedy. It means acknowledging a brutal reality, that Indigenous women have been systematically targeted, violated, and erased for generations. And that this violence is not ancient history, but ongoing crisis. It means recognizing that colonization isn't something that happened in the past, but a structure that continues to enable violence in the present. It means understanding that when we talk about missing and murdered Indigenous women, we're talking about mothers and daughters, sisters and friends, women with dreams and futures, and people who love them. We're talking about women like Savannah. 22 years old, excited to be a mother, working toward a career in nursing, in love with her high school sweetheart, planning a life. We're talking about a young woman who went upstairs to help a neighbor and never came home. The Spirit Lake tribe honored Savannah with a memorial service attended by hundreds. They spoke her Dakota name, where thunder finds her. They remembered her kindness, her laughter, her love for children and elderly people. They mourned not just a woman, but a future, all the years she should have had, all the moments with her daughter that were stolen from both of them. Hazley Jo will grow up knowing her mother through stories and photographs, through the fierce love of her family, through the legacy of change that Savannah's death sparked. She'll learn about Savannah's act. She'll understand that her mother's name is spoken in congressional hearings and tribal council meetings, that it appears in legislation and government reports, that it has become a rallying cry for justice. But she'll also learn the simpler things, that her mother liked horses and animals, that she was good with kids, that she had green eyes and freckles, that she dreamed of being a nurse, that she loved Ashton since she was 14 years old, that she chose the name Hazley Jo with such care and hope. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, hold this thought: every missing woman has a name. Every murdered woman was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother, someone's love. They had favorite songs and inside jokes, dreams they whispered to themselves in the dark, futures they were building one day at a time. Savannah LaFontaine Greywind, Hannah Harris, Tina Fontaine. The list goes on, names you've heard and names you haven't. Women whose disappearances made headlines and women whose cases were never even reported. Remember them. Speak their names. Demand better. Because every woman deserves to be safe in her own home, in her own body, in her own life. Every woman deserves to walk upstairs to help a neighbor and come back home again. If you're still awake and listening, check whether you've left your little goodnight comment. I always check your comments before I sleep too. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight we'll explore a story that challenges our understanding of family, identity, and the invisible threads that connect us to those we've never known. Tonight's case is one of complexity and tragedy, a reminder that sometimes the search for belonging can lead us down paths we never imagined. This is the story of Katie Plattell, a young woman who went looking for her roots and found something far darker than she could have anticipated. As we settle in, we'll journey through this tale, one that unfolds slowly across 2 decades, spanning from the early days of the internet to a series of events that would leave multiple families forever changed. Our story begins in 1995, in a time when the internet was still new and mysterious, when chat rooms connected strangers across vast distances, and when a 20-year-old man named Stephen Plattell logged on and met a 15-year-old girl named Alyssa Garcia. Stephen was young himself, navigating early adulthood without direction or purpose. Alyssa was just a teenager in San Antonio, Texas, curious about the world beyond her immediate surroundings. Their online conversations grew more frequent, more intimate. What began as innocent messages transformed into something else entirely. And by the time Stephen traveled to Texas to meet Alyssa in person, a relationship had already formed that would prove impossible for the young girl to resist. Alyssa became pregnant at 16. In January 1998, when she was just 17 years old, she gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Denise. From the very beginning, Alyssa sensed something was wrong with Stephen. He was unable to hold down a job, his mood swinging unpredictably from withdrawn silence to explosive rage. The small apartment they shared became a pressure cooker of tension. Stephen would beat their cats when frustrated. He would yell until his voice cracked. And worst of all, he turned his rage toward their infant daughter. Alyssa would later recount horrifying details. Stephen would pinch baby Denise until her small body was covered in black and blue marks. When the baby cried, which infants do, Stephen couldn't tolerate the sound. He would place Denise inside a cooler and close the lid, muffling her desperate wails while Alyssa fought to free her daughter before she suffocated. He wanted to be rid of her, Alyssa would recall years later. He didn't like the crying. Alyssa faced an impossible choice. She was barely out of childhood herself, trapped with an abusive partner, watching her infant daughter suffer. Despite everything, she stayed with Stephen. They married, perhaps out of hope that things would improve. Perhaps because she saw no other option. But by the time Denise was 8 months old, Alyssa knew what she had to do. It was so hard to give her up, she would say. But I had to because I wanted her to live and be happy. In 1998, Alyssa placed Denise up for adoption. It was an act of love born from desperation. A mother choosing her daughter's survival over her own desire to keep her close. Denise Plattl became Katie Rose Fusco when she was adopted by Anthony and Kelly Fusco, a couple from Dover, New York, a small town about 80 miles north of New York City. Anthony had served in the U.S. Coast Guard before working for 20 years as a correctional officer at the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut. Kelly was warm and nurturing. Together, they gave Katie the stable, loving home that Alyssa had dreamed of for her daughter. Katie thrived. She grew up with an adoptive sister named Nicole, and by all accounts, her childhood was entirely normal. Her uncle Kerry Gould would later describe it simply, they had a very, very normal life. He gave Katie the nickname Pac-Man because she was always eating, always energetic, always present. Katie loved animals with a deep, instinctive compassion. She became a vegetarian, drawn to protecting creatures that couldn't protect themselves. She had a particular fondness for rescuing stray cats, bringing them home and nursing them back to health. But it was art that became Katie's sanctuary, and her voice. She was talented with a pen and paper, known at Dover High School for her comic strips. Her drawings were more than entertainment. They were statements. She once created an entire portfolio depicting the struggles of women throughout American history. In her own words, written in a blog post, she explained, "A pen and something to draw on became a safe place for me. Ink became my weapon against rules and regulations. To be short, for me, a life without art is no life at all." Katie was also an activist in her own quiet way. She led a group of female students who petitioned the Dover Board of Education to change what they believed was a sexist dress code. She was unafraid to challenge authority when she felt it was unjust. By the time she graduated from Dover High School in 2016, Katie had plans. She would attend Dutchess Community College and study digital advertising, combining her artistic talents with practical career goals. Everything was set. Her future stretched before her, full of possibility. But there was one question that had always lingered in the back of Katie's mind. A question that many adopted children eventually ask. Where did I come from? Who are my biological parents? When Katie turned 18 in January 2016, she decided to find out. Katie's search led her to Facebook, where she found Stephen and Alyssa Plattl. They were living in Henrico County, Virginia, near Richmond, with their 2 other daughters, Katie's biological half-sisters. The excitement of reconnection rippled through everyone involved. Alyssa, who had spent 18 years hoping for this moment, was overjoyed. Stephen appeared equally eager to welcome his firstborn daughter back into his life. By August 2016, Katie had made a decision that worried her adoptive parents, but one they ultimately supported. She would move to Virginia and live with the Plattls, getting to know her biological family, understanding where she came from, filling in the blank spaces of her identity. Katie didn't know that she was walking into a home that was already fracturing. By the time she arrived, Stephen and Alyssa's marriage was crumbling. They had already decided to separate and were sleeping in separate bedrooms. Alyssa had endured years of emotional and verbal abuse. I was always on eggshells, she would later explain. Whatever his mood was, everybody knew. And that mood was often not happy. A lot of yelling. A lot of things smashed in the house in front of our kids. Alyssa tried to warn Katie. In private conversations, she told Katie that Stephen had abused her as a baby, that his violence was the real reason she'd been given up for adoption. She wanted Katie to understand what kind of man her biological father was. But Katie, at 18, didn't seem concerned. Perhaps she couldn't imagine her charming father, so eager to connect with her, being capable of such things. Perhaps she thought Alyssa was exaggerating, driven by bitterness from a failed marriage. What happened next unfolded with a disturbing quickness. Stephen's behavior changed after Katie moved in. He began paying more attention to his appearance, shaving his beard, wearing tighter clothing. He became fixated on Katie in a way that made Alyssa deeply uncomfortable. Within weeks, Stephen began sleeping on the floor of Katie's bedroom. When Alyssa confronted him about this inappropriate behavior, Stephen told her it was none of her business. He stormed out of the house and Katie went with him. In November 2016, just 3 months after Katie had arrived, Alyssa moved out. Stephen and Alyssa arranged shared custody of their 2 younger daughters, but the family had effectively split apart, and then Stephen and Katie were alone together in that house. Over the months that followed, something developed between Stephen and Katie that defied natural boundaries. It's here that we must pause and consider a phenomenon that experts sometimes call genetic sexual attraction, a controversial term used to describe intense physical and emotional feelings that can emerge when adopted individuals reunite with close biological relatives they've never known. Some psychologists theorize that this attraction might be a delayed response to missed bonding, the absence of the normal parent-child relationship that typically creates a natural barrier to romantic feelings. Others question whether such a phenomenon truly exists, or whether it's simply a label applied to predatory behavior disguised as something more complicated. What is clear is that Stephen, a man in his early 40s with a history of abuse and manipulation, and Katie, an 18-year-old woman searching for connection and identity, began a sexual relationship. In May 2017, Alyssa discovered the truth in the most heartbreaking way possible. Her 11-year-old daughter, Katie's half-sister, had been keeping a journal. In its pages, she had written, "Katie is pregnant. Dad says they feel like couples. Did they get a little too drunk that night? My dad is a slut. He's Satan." The child's journal revealed something else that made Alyssa's blood run cold. Stephen had instructed his 2 younger daughters to refer to Katie not as their sister, but as their stepmother. When Alyssa confronted Stephen, he confirmed everything. Yes, Katie was pregnant. Yes, he was the father. And yes, he intended to marry her. Alyssa immediately reported the relationship to authorities. When the Henrico County Child Advocacy Center interviewed Stephen and Alyssa's other children, they confirmed what the journal had revealed. But by the time police issued arrest warrants, Stephen and Katie had fled to Wake County, North Carolina. On July 20, 2017, Stephen and Katie obtained a marriage license in Parkton, Maryland. They lied on the documents, falsely stating that they were not related. The ceremony was small, but witnessed by people who should have known better. Stephen's mother and Katie's adoptive parents, Anthony and Kelly Fusco. Why did the Fuscos attend their daughter's wedding to her biological father? Perhaps they were in denial. Perhaps they hoped that their presence would keep Katie safe, that maintaining a connection would allow them to help her eventually. Perhaps they simply didn't know what else to do. On September 1, 2017, Katie gave birth to a son. They named him Bennett Kieron Pledl. The baby was simultaneously Katie's son and her brother Stephen's son and grandson. Katie posted photos on social media of herself, Stephen and baby Bennett. She used hashtags like just married and pregnant. To anyone scrolling past, they might have looked like any other young family celebrating new life. But the authorities had not forgotten about them. In January 2018, Knightdale police charged Stephen and Katie Pledl with incest, adultery, and contributing to the delinquency of a minor. They were both arrested and taken into custody in Wake County, North Carolina. The case quickly received international attention. Headlines flashed across news outlets worldwide, each one more sensational than the last. Man impregnates biological daughter, plans to marry her. The public was simultaneously horrified and fascinated. Both Stephen and Katie were extradited back to Virginia to face trial. Stephen was released on bond. Katie remained in custody initially, but was later also released on a secured bond of $12,000. The judge issued clear orders. Stephen and Katie were not to have any contact with each other. Custody of baby Bennett was awarded to Stephen's mother, who lived in Knightdale, North Carolina. Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman II, defended his client vigorously. He characterized the relationship as consensual, emphasizing that Katie was an 18-year-old woman when it began. He told reporters, "This case is an 18-year-old girl who shows up at the doorstep of a 40-year-old man who's going through difficult times with his wife. They have a bond because they're biologically related, but they never knew each other before they had a sexual relationship. He was head over heels in love with her, so much so that outweighed the issue of them being biologically related." The attorney's framing was problematic on multiple levels. It placed responsibility on Katie, portraying her as an adult, making autonomous choices, while downplaying Stephen's role as her biological father, a man with a documented history of abuse, someone who should have protected her rather than exploited her vulnerability. If convicted, Stephen and Katie each faced up to 10 years in prison for the felony incest charge, plus additional time for contributing to the delinquency of a minor. After her release on bond, Katie moved back to Dover, New York, to live with Anthony and Kelly Fusco in their mobile home park. The conditions of her release required her to reside with her adoptive parents, though she was allowed to travel outside the state. Every Tuesday and Thursday, Katie would make the same trip. She and Anthony would drive to Waterbury, Connecticut, to visit Katie's adoptive grandmother, helping her clean her house and spending time with her. It became a routine, a predictable pattern, and then Katie made a phone call that would seal everyone's fate. In early April 2018, Katie called Stephen. Over the phone, she told him that she didn't want to continue their relationship. She wanted out. The exact content of that conversation will never be fully known, but Stephen's response was immediate and devastating. Katie's words had shattered whatever fantasy Stephen had constructed about their future together. In his mind, Katie wasn't just leaving him as a partner. She was abandoning him as a daughter, rejecting him completely. For Stephen, a man who had demonstrated throughout his life that he responded to loss of control with violence, this rejection became unforgivable. On April 11, 2018, Stephen convinced his mother to give him baby Bennett. He told her he wanted to take the infant to New York so that Katie could see him. His mother, trusting her son, agreed. Stephen drove back to his home on Earlston Court in Knightdale, North Carolina. There, alone with his 7-month-old son, Stephen committed an act of unspeakable cruelty. He suffocated Bennett, likely by smothering him, and hid the baby's tiny body in a closet. The next morning, April 12, 2018, Stephen's mother requested a welfare check. When Knightdale police arrived at 9:30 a.m., they found Bennett's body. The chief medical examiner would later confirm that the infant had died of suffocation. Sometime on April 11th, officers who responded to the scene were devastated. Many of our officers are mothers and fathers themselves, Police Chief Lawrence Capps would later say. "I would be lying to you if I didn't say that a situation like this certainly does stir deep emotions." But Stephen wasn't finished. While police in North Carolina were discovering Bennett's body, Stephen Pladl was in Dover, New York, approximately 550 miles away. He had parked his minivan near the Wingdale Beer and Liquor Store, just outside the mobile home park where Katie was living with Anthony and Kelly Fusco. Surveillance cameras captured him waiting there, watching the entrance. Stephen knew Katie's routine. He knew that every Tuesday and Thursday, she and Anthony would drive to Waterbury, Connecticut. He knew the route they would take. Around 8:40 that Thursday morning, Katie and her adoptive father left the mobile home park in their pickup truck, heading toward Connecticut to visit Katie's grandmother. Stephen followed them in his minivan. The drive from Dover to Waterbury takes about an hour. Katie and Anthony likely talked during the drive, perhaps about ordinary things. Perhaps about Katie's future now that she was trying to rebuild her life. They had no way of knowing that Stephen was behind them, that he had brought his Arrow AR-15 style rifle, that he had already killed their grandson just hours before. At the intersection of Routes 7 and 55 in New Milford, Connecticut, a rural area surrounded by farmland, Katie and Anthony stopped at a stop sign. Stephen pulled up beside their vehicle. A nearby resident, Jeff Weinzeville, was outside tending to his horses. At approximately 8:40 a.m., he heard gunfire. It sounded like he emptied out his clip, Weinzeville would later recall. It scared the bejesus out of the horses. "A lot of people hunt out here and were used to hearing gunshots, but I knew right away something was wrong with this." Stephen had opened fire with his assault rifle, shooting multiple rounds into the pickup truck. Katie died from gunshot wounds to her head, neck, torso, and upper extremities. Anthony died from similar injuries. The attack was brutal, thorough, designed to ensure neither would survive. Winseville immediately called 911. By the time police arrived, Stephen was already gone. Stephen drove approximately 18 miles from the murder scene to Dover, New York, the same small town where Katie had grown up, where she'd gone to high school, where she'd once felt safe. He pulled his minivan over on Dogtail Corners Road, near the 10-Mile River. He left the engine running, and then Stephen called his mother. The 911 call she made immediately afterward captured her anguished disbelief. "Oh God, he told me to call the police and I shouldn't go over there," she cried to the dispatcher. "He killed his baby and he's in the house." She went on, "His wife broke up with him yesterday over the phone. She's in New York and he told me he was on his way and after bringing the baby to her and then he was coming back." There was a pause. And then, "I can't even believe this is happening." A Dutchess County probation officer spotted Stephen's minivan parked on the side of the road. Police from multiple agencies converged on the location. Dutchess County Sheriff's Office, New York State Police, and New Milford Police. As officers approached the vehicle, they found Stephen Plattle dead inside, killed by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. In the span of less than 24 hours, 4 people had died across 3 states, North Carolina, Connecticut, and New York. An infant, a young woman, a man who had devoted his life to protecting others, and the man who had killed them all. The investigation revealed the full timeline. Stephen had murdered his infant son on April 11, hidden his body, then driven through the night to stalk Katie. He had waited until the perfect moment when she and Anthony were isolated on a rural road and opened fire. After confessing to his mother, he had taken his own life rather than face justice. We may never understand the mindset or motives of Stephen Plattle. Police Chief Lawrence Capps said at a press conference, "But we do know his actions have shattered the lives of countless people." The case sparked intense discussions about genetic sexual attraction, about the responsibilities of the court system, about how such a tragedy could have been prevented. Critics pointed out that Stephen had been released on bond despite his documented history of abuse, despite the clear power imbalance in his relationship with Katie, despite the danger he posed. Stephen's attorney, Rick Friedman II, said that his client had shown no signs of violence in their final meetings. Nobody ever could have predicted Stephen's actions, he claimed. But others disagreed. Alyssa Plattle, Stephen's ex-wife and Katie's biological mother, felt devastated and betrayed. "There are no words to describe the sense of betrayal and disgust I'm feeling," Alyssa told reporters. "I waited 18 long years to have a relationship with my daughter, and now he's completely destroyed it." Alyssa had given up Katie to save her life. She had spent nearly 2 decades hoping for a reunion. And when that reunion finally came, Stephen had manipulated Katie, exploited her vulnerability, and ultimately killed her. On April 20 and 21, 2018, more than 100 people gathered at the Hofcut Funeral Home in Dover Plains, New York, for calling hours and then a funeral mass at St. Charles Borromeo Church. 3 caskets stood together. Katie Rose Fusco Plattle, age 20. Bennett Kieron Plattle, age 7 months. Anthony Charles Fusco, age 56. Katie's obituary remembered her as an artist, a creator, someone in the process of pursuing a career using her talents and passions. It noted her love for animals, especially her commitment to rescuing stray cats. It mentioned that she was a superior drummer, a detail that many who knew her casually might not have known. Anthony's obituary described him as someone who devoted himself to the people around him, a man ripped from the lives of his wife Kelly and the rest of his family. He had served his country, served his community as a corrections officer, and in retirement had worked part-time as a security guard. He had been protecting his daughter when he died. Bennett never got the chance to have an obituary that described his personality, his interests, his dreams. He was 7 months old. His entire life had been overshadowed by the circumstances of his conception and birth, and he died before he could ever know anything different. All 3 were buried together in St. Charles Cemetery in Dover Plains, their graves a permanent reminder of a tragedy that never should have happened. Kelly Fusco lost both her husband and her daughter. Alyssa Plattle lost the daughter she had given up to save, only to have her killed by the very man Alyssa had protected her from. Stephen and Alyssa's 2 younger daughters lost their sister, their nephew, and their father in one terrible moment. The ripples of Stephen Plattle's violence extended outward, touching dozens of lives. destroying families, leaving questions that would never be fully answered. What could have been done differently? The question haunts everyone who has studied this case. Some point to the court system. Stephen was released on bond, despite clear evidence of his abusive history. The judge ordered that Stephen and Katie have no contact, but there was no GPS monitoring, no mechanism to enforce that order effectively. Custody of Bennett was given to Stephen's mother, who had no way of knowing her son would use access to the child as a tool for murder. Others point to the concept of genetic sexual attraction itself, questioning whether it provides cover for predatory behavior. Stephen was 42 years old when Katie moved in with him. She was 18, technically an adult but barely out of childhood. Searching for identity and belonging, the power imbalance was enormous. He was her father, someone who should have protected her, guided her, maintained appropriate boundaries. Instead, he exploited her vulnerability. Katie's own choices also raise painful questions, though they must be considered with deep empathy. Why did she enter into a relationship with Stephen? Why did she marry him? Why did she have a baby with him? The answers likely involve complex psychology. The trauma of adoption, the desire to please a biological parent she just met, possible manipulation and grooming by someone who had decades more life experience. We must also consider that Katie was a victim long before April 12, 2018. She was victimized as an infant when Stephen abused her. She was victimized at 18 when he initiated a sexual relationship with her. She was victimized by a court system that failed to adequately protect her from her abuser. And she was finally fatally victimized when Stephen decided that if he couldn't have her, no one would. The case also raises questions about adoption and biological reunion. Katie's story is not typical of adoptees who reconnect with birth families. The vast majority of these reunions are positive or at least neutral. But Katie's case reminds us that reunion can be dangerous when one party has a history of violence and abuse. Should there have been more caution? Should someone have insisted that Katie undergo counseling before moving in with the Platas? Should authorities have investigated Stephen's history before allowing an unsupervised reunion? These are impossible questions to answer without the benefit of hindsight. At the time, Katie was 18, legally an adult capable of making her own decisions. Her adoptive parents supported her choice to connect with her biological family because they loved her and wanted her to be happy. No one could have predicted how catastrophically wrong it would all go. The story of Katie and Stephen Pladl is not a story with simple moral lessons. It's a story about the complicated nature of family, identity, and the darkness that can exist in people who appear normal on the surface. Stephen Pladl was a murderer, an abuser, someone who preyed on vulnerability and responded to rejection with unspeakable violence. But to those who didn't know his history, he might have seemed like a devoted father excited to reconnect with his daughter, a man head over heels in love. Katie Pladl was a victim, but she was also a person with agency, someone who made choices that we might struggle to understand. She was an artist, an activist, a young woman with dreams of a career in advertising. She was someone who loved animals and fought for what she believed was right. She was complicated, as all humans are. Anthony Fusco was a hero who died protecting his daughter. He had given Katie a safe, loving childhood. He had supported her desire to connect with her biological family, even though he was worried. He had driven her to Connecticut that day, just as he had done every Tuesday and Thursday, because he loved her and wanted to help her. And Bennett Pladl was the most innocent victim of all. An infant who never had a chance to be anything other than a symbol of the dysfunction that surrounded his birth. In 2024, Lifetime made a television movie about this case called Husband, Father, Killer, The Alyssa Pladl Story. It was part of their Ripped from the Headlines series. Some criticized the movie for sensationalizing the tragedy. Others felt it was important to tell the story, to honor the victims, to ensure that Katie, Anthony, and Bennett weren't forgotten. The truth is that no movie, no news article, no podcast, and no YouTube video can fully capture what happened. We can only try to understand, to piece together the evidence, to ask difficult questions, and to remember that behind every headline are real people whose lives were destroyed. As you drift towards sleep, let this story remind you that family is both the source of our greatest comfort and sometimes our deepest pain. The search for identity is a fundamental human drive, but it must be approached with caution and support. Katie Pladl was looking for belonging when she reached out to her biological parents. What she found instead was manipulation, exploitation, and ultimately death. Her story is a tragedy in the truest sense. A series of events that seemed inevitable, only in hindsight. A cascade of poor decisions and missed warning signs that led to an ending no one wanted. Tonight, remember Katie not for how she died, but for how she lived. As an artist, an activist, a young woman who loved animals and believed in fighting for what was right. Remember Anthony as a father who gave his life protecting his daughter. Remember Bennett as an innocent child who deserved better than the circumstances of his birth and death. And perhaps remember Stephen too, not with sympathy but as a warning. He represents the danger of unchecked power imbalances, of violence that simmers beneath the surface, of a system that sometimes fails to protect the vulnerable from those who would harm them. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. Tonight we journey to the quiet suburbs of South Carolina, where manicured lawns stretch beneath southern pines, and neighborhoods bear names that promise tranquility. This is a story about secrets hidden behind polished doors, about the dangerous games people play when desperation takes hold, and about two lives that ended on a spring afternoon when everything finally came crashing down. Let the sounds of this story wash over you as we explore what happened in April of 2012 in a place called Ascot Estates. The Ascot neighborhood sits in Irmo, South Carolina, just outside Columbia. If you were to drive through it, you'd see exactly what you'd expect from an upscale suburban development built in the early 2000s. Large brick homes, each one unique in its grandeur, lots that span half an acre or more, tree-lined streets with proper sidewalks. A community pool where children splash on summer afternoons. Tennis courts that echo with the rhythmic thwack of balls. Everything designed to suggest success, stability, comfort. It was the kind of neighborhood where people moved to mark their arrival. A place that said they'd made it. Brett and Tammy Jo Parker lived on Taqueria Court, in one of these substantial homes. From the outside, they seemed to embody the American dream. Brett worked in pharmaceutical sales, a respectable career that required a certain charm. A gift for persuasion, Tammy Jo had built an impressive career in sales as well, earning approximately $160,000 annually. More than Brett, in fact. She was the primary breadwinner, the financial anchor of the family. They had 2 children together, teenagers navigating high school with all its attendant dramas and dreams. Their 17th wedding anniversary was approaching that spring. To neighbors, to friends, to anyone looking in from the outside, the Parkers appeared to be living a comfortable middle-class existence marked by all the ordinary concerns of suburban family life. But beneath the surface, nothing was as it seemed. Brett Parker had a secret life, one that existed in the shadows of his respectable daytime persona. He ran an illegal sports betting operation, a full-scale bookmaking business that operated out of his home. In the parlance of those who knew about it, Brett wasn't just involved in gambling. He was referred to as the kingpin of the operation in the Midlands area. Money flowed through his hands in staggering amounts. Bets were placed, odds were calculated, wins and losses tallied. It was a world of adrenaline and risk, of quick cash and mounting debts. Working alongside Brett was his father, Jack Parker, who helped run the operation. And there was Brian Kapnerhurst, a man who would become central to this story in the most tragic way possible. Brian Kapnerhurst was 46 years old that spring. He had grown up in Trenton, Michigan, but had made his life in South Carolina. In his younger years, Brian had been an athlete of considerable promise. A 4-year starter on the baseball team at Morehead State University. Talented enough to be considered a top major league prospect during his junior year. But like so many dreams of athletic glory, that path didn't pan out the way he'd hoped. Instead, Brian had built a different kind of life. He worked as the assistant athletic director for the Lexington County Recreation and Aging Commission, a position he'd held for nearly 25 years. He coached in the Dixie Youth Baseball League, mentoring young players, teaching them the fundamentals of the game he'd once played so well. To those who knew him through his work, Brian was dedicated, patient, someone who genuinely cared about helping kids develop their skills. But Brian had his own struggles. He worked 3 jobs trying to make ends meet, yet money was always tight. He owed approximately $25,000 in various debts. His wife Cindy had once been arrested and charged with embezzling $35,000 from a bank, money that according to court testimony went toward paying off Brian's mounting gambling debts. Because Brian, like Brett, was caught in the grip of gambling addiction. Brian served as a record keeper for Brett's operation, helping to track the complex web of bets and payouts. But he also gambled himself, making bets he couldn't afford to lose, digging himself deeper into financial trouble. And crucially, Brett owed him money, approximately $21,300. In the precarious economy of illegal gambling, where debts between associates can't be settled through legal channels, this created a dangerous tension. There was something else too, adding layers of complication to Brett's life. He was having affairs. One woman, Lindsay Mullins, would later testify at his trial about their relationship. She'd met Brett when she worked as a bank teller, and they'd begun meeting for sexual encounters. She testified that they'd even met at the Parker home on at least one occasion. Brett had told her he wanted to separate from his wife, but that doing so would be financially difficult. Financially difficult indeed, because Tammy Jo wasn't just earning significantly more than Brett. She also had a life insurance policy, a substantial one, more than $1 million, with Brett listed as the beneficiary. To investigators who would later piece together the puzzle, this created a triangle of motive, crushing debt, extramarital affairs, and a 7-figure insurance payout waiting in the wings. But in early April of 2012, life in the Parker household continued in its dual nature. Respectable pharmaceutical salesman by day, underground gambling kingpin by night. The bills kept coming, the debts kept mounting, and Brian Kapnerhurst kept asking for his money. April 13th, 2012 fell on a Friday. In the Parker household, it began like many other days. The children were at school. Tammy Jo was working upstairs in her home office, likely making calls, sending emails, handling the details of her sales career that kept the family financially afloat. Brett was home as well, at some point that morning or early afternoon. Phone calls were exchanged between Brett and Brian. The exact content of these conversations would be scrutinized later, but their purpose seemed clear enough. Brian was coming over. He wanted to talk about the money Brett owed him. According to what Brian told his wife Cindy before leaving home, he was apprehensive about this meeting. More than apprehensive. He was worried enough to give Cindy specific instructions. If she didn't hear from him within an hour of arriving at Brett's house, she should call the police. Think about that for a moment. This was a man going to visit someone he'd known for years. Someone he'd worked alongside in their gambling operation. Someone who lived in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. Yet he was worried enough about his own safety that he arranged for his wife to call the authorities if something went wrong. Brian feared that Brett would become violent when confronted about the debt. Around 9 o'clock that evening, Brian Kapnerhurst drove to the Parker home on Taqueria Court. He parked outside the large brick house. He carried a duffel bag. Inside were bullets. Later examination would reveal whether he brought these for his own protection or for some other reason would become a matter of heated debate. Security cameras on the Parker property captured Brian entering the house. The timestamp was important. Brian walked through the door at a specific moment, and investigators would later study that footage, frame by frame, second by second, building a timeline that would prove crucial to understanding what really happened. Inside the house, in an upstairs office space, Tammy Jo Parker was shot. The medical examiner would later determine she'd been shot multiple times, 4 times in the body and once in the head. These were close-range shots, intimate in the terrible way that gunshot wounds between people who know each other often are. She was shot with a 9mm pistol. Her body came to rest in the bathroom, her legs extending out into the living space, a detail that first responders would note when they arrived. Brian Kapnerhurst was shot in a different location, a corridor on the 2nd floor near where Brett kept a safe. He was shot 4 times with a different weapon, a 24 Nen caliber Taurus Judge revolver. The fatal wounds struck his head and chest, but he'd also been shot in the arm, leg, and foot. He collapsed there, near the safe, and when sheriff's deputies arrived, they found a 9mm pistol, the same type of gun that had killed Tammy in Brian's hand. At approximately 1:04 p.m., a frantic 911 call came in from the Parker residence. The caller was Brett Parker, and he was in distress, or at least he sounded that way. His voice carried panic, fear, the kind of emotion you'd expect from someone who just lived through something traumatic. "A friend of mine, Brian," he told the operator when asked who had shot his wife. Brett's story came out in a rush. Brian Kapnerhurst had come to the house, angry, aggressive, armed. According to Brett, he directed Brian upstairs to discuss the debt he owed. Brett said he was downstairs, in the bathroom, when he heard gunshots from above. He ran upstairs and saw Brian standing there, having just shot Tammy. Brian then turned his attention to Brett, demanding that he open the safe. Brett, finding himself in a life-or-death situation, managed to grab a revolver he kept on top of the safe. In the struggle that followed, Brett shot Brian in what he insisted was self-defense. It was him or Brian. He'd had no choice. When sheriff's deputies from Richland County arrived at the scene, the physical evidence seemed to support Brett's account. There was Tammy Jo Parker, dead from gunshot wounds. There was Brian Kapnerhurst, also dead, with a 9mm pistol in his hand. The same gun that had killed Tammy, Brett's revolver, recently fired, lay in the downstairs family room. Brian's duffel bag sat nearby, opened with a box of ammunition visible on top. It looked at first glance exactly like what Brett said it was. A robbery gone horribly wrong. A friend who'd turned violent. A husband who'd acted to save himself. But investigator Stan Smith of the Richland County Sheriff's Department had a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. Within 24 hours of the shooting, despite how the crime scene appeared, investigators began to have serious doubts about Brett Parker's story. Stan Smith, the lead investigator, was experienced enough to know that things aren't always what they seem. He looked at the evidence, and he looked at Brett Parker, and he made a commitment, not to Brett, but to Tammy Jo Parker. He would get to the bottom of this. He would determine what the truth really was. He would do her justice. The first red flags were small things. Details that didn't quite add up. Brett had claimed he was in the downstairs bathroom when he heard gunshots from the upstairs office. But when a deputy walked through the scene, he noticed something. The toilet seat was still in the upward position. If Brett had been using the bathroom when the shooting started, wouldn't the seat be down? It was a small detail, but murder investigations are often solved through an accumulation of small details. Investigators pulled the phone records for Brett, Tammy, and Brian. They studied the calls made that day, building a timeline of communication. They examined the home security camera footage, watching it over and over, noting the exact moment Brian entered the house. They calculated how much time elapsed between Brian's arrival and Brett's 911 call. 11 minutes. Brian Kapnerhurst had entered the Parker home, and 11 minutes later, Brett Parker called 911 to report that Brian had shot Tammy and threatened him, forcing him to shoot Brian in self-defense. 11 minutes for Brian to come in, shoot Tammy multiple times, force Brett upstairs at gunpoint, demand access to the safe, get into a struggle, and end up shot dead himself. Could all of that really have happened in 11 minutes? Prosecutors would later argue that the timeline was impossibly tight for Brett's version of events. But it would be perfect for a different scenario, Brett shooting Tammy first, then waiting for Brian to arrive, shooting him shortly after he walked in, and staging the scene to make it look like self-defense. Then investigators discovered something else. Gunpowder residue. Not on Brett's hands, though. There was some there, but on the window blinds in the downstairs area. The shooting had happened upstairs. So, why was there gunpowder residue on the first floor blinds? The logical conclusion, someone had fired a weapon, then gone downstairs and peeked out through the blinds. Perhaps watching for Brian's arrival, or checking to make sure no neighbors had noticed anything amiss. The gunpowder residue had transferred from the shooter's hands to the blinds. It took investigators 43 days of careful examination to notice this crucial piece of evidence. They'd been studying the security camera footage from every angle, including what seemed like irrelevant views, when they noticed something in a frame, something that ultimately led them to examine those blinds. The defense would later argue that the gunpowder residue could have gotten there in numerous ways, especially given that 80 to 100 police officers had been through the scene in the days following the shooting. But to investigators, it suggested that Brett's story wasn't just improbable, it was a lie. They dug deeper into Brett's life. They uncovered the full extent of the illegal gambling operation. They discovered that Brett owed a significant amount of money, over $100,000, to one associate alone, a man named Laney Gunter, who would later testify at trial while shackled in a blue prison jumpsuit, having been convicted on federal gambling charges himself. They learned about the $1 million life insurance policy on Tammy's life. They interviewed Lindsay Mullins, the woman with whom Brett had been having an affair, who testified about their relationship and Brett's comments about wanting to leave his marriage, but finding it financially difficult. They talked to Cindy Kapnerhurst, Brian's widow, who told them about her husband's fears regarding the meeting with Brett, about his warning to call police if he didn't contact her within an hour. This was crucial. It established that Brian had gone to the house, apprehensive but not aggressive. He wasn't planning violence. He was worried about being a victim of it. And investigators examined Brian's physical condition more closely. The medical examiner discovered that Brian had an old arm injury that made it difficult for him to grip objects firmly. The 9mm pistol found in his hand, could he have actually held and fired it effectively, or had someone placed it there after he was already dead? Moreover, the ballistics told their own story. Brett's fingerprint was found on bullets that were in Brian's duffel bag. How would Brett's prints have gotten on Brian's ammunition unless Brett had handled those bullets himself? Perhaps while setting up the scene. On July 20th, 2012, 97 days after the shooting, Brett Parker was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. In May of 2013, Brett Parker stood trial in Richland County. The proceedings stretched over 3 weeks, and the courtroom heard 2 dramatically different versions of the same event. The defense, led by attorney Dave Fedor, a veteran lawyer who'd practiced in Columbia for more than 50 years, maintained Brett's original story. Brian Kapnerhurst had killed Tammy Jo in a violent rage when he came to collect money. Brett had killed Brian in self-defense. It was a tragedy. Yes, but it was a justified shooting. Brett was defending his own life. Fedor made several arguments on his client's behalf. First, he pointed out that Brett had no reason to kill Tammy. She was, as Fedor put it, the goose that lays the golden egg. She earned $160,000 a year. Why would Brett kill the family's primary source of income? It made no sense. Second, Fedor argued that Brian Kapnerhurst was desperate. Brian was drowning in debt, working 3 jobs, with a wife who had a criminal record for embezzling money to cover his gambling losses. Brian was the one who needed money badly enough to kill for it. Third, and this was perhaps the most unusual defense argument, Fedor told the jury that Brett was no Einstein. He wasn't smart enough to pull off such a complex scheme, to stage such an elaborate crime scene. If Brett had really planned to kill his wife and frame Brian, Fedor argued, he wouldn't have been able to do it convincingly. Brett Parker himself took the stand in his own defense, testifying for nearly 3 hours on a Friday afternoon. He admitted he'd been a bookie. He admitted he'd had an affair, though he claimed he and Tammy still loved each other and stayed together for their children. Me and Tammy got along fine, he said. We loved each other. I would never lay a hand on her. On describing the shooting, Brett's voice broke with emotion. I was panicked, he said. I immediately turned and just kept pulling the trigger. I was scared the whole time. He insisted he'd made a split-second decision. It was him or me. During cross-examination, when prosecutors questioned his actions immediately after the shooting, Brett grew frustrated. You gone sit here and tell me after what I was going through, is there a book on what you're supposed to do? He demanded. Because I was out of my mind. I had just killed somebody, and now I'm sitting there looking at my wife laying there in a puddle of blood. It was a powerful moment. A man in genuine distress, or a performance by someone who knew he was in serious trouble. The prosecution, led by Fifth Circuit Assistant Solicitor Luck Campbell, presented a very different narrative. This wasn't self-defense, Campbell argued. This was calculated murder, planned and executed to solve Brett Parker's mounting problems in one terrible afternoon. The motive was clear. Brett was drowning in gambling debt, facing pressure from associates he owed, and trapped in a marriage to a woman who earned more than he did and who would be difficult to divorce without significant financial consequences. But if Tammy died, there was that $1 million insurance policy, and if Brian died while seemingly in the process of committing murder, well, that eliminated both a witness and a creditor. Prosecutors walked the jury through the timeline evidence, emphasizing those crucial 11 minutes between Brian's arrival and the 911 call. They presented the gunpowder residue on the blinds. They highlighted the ballistic evidence and the medical examiner's testimony about Brian's arm injury. They pointed out the close-range nature of Tammy's wounds, suggesting an intimate killing rather than a panic shooting during a robbery. They also presented the phone records showing a series of calls between Brett and Brian before Brian came to the house, suggesting that Brett had lured Brian there under false pretenses, perhaps promising to pay the debt, or at least to discuss it. And they demolished Brett's hope of using South Carolina's stand your ground law as a defense. Under that law, a person can use deadly force to protect themselves without a duty to retreat first, but only if they're not engaged in unlawful activity at the time, since Brett was operating an illegal gambling business from his home. The stand your ground defense didn't apply. He couldn't claim legal immunity for actions taken while committing a crime. The prosecution's theory of the crime went like this. Brett shot Tammy first, while she was working in her upstairs office. He shot her multiple times, ensuring she was dead. Then he went downstairs, perhaps checking out the window through those blinds to watch for Brian's arrival. When Brian showed up, possibly led into the house by Brett himself, Brett shot him multiple times with the revolver. Then Brett staged the scene, placing the 9mm pistol in Brian's hand, opening Brian's duffel bag to display the ammunition, positioning everything to look like a robbery gone wrong. Finally, he called 911 and delivered his rehearsed story about Brian shooting Tammy and threatening him. That 3 weeks of testimony, dozens of witnesses, crime scene photographs that showed the violence in stark, undeniable detail, so graphic that there were audible gasps in the courtroom when they were displayed. And then just before 5 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, the jury received the case for deliberation. They returned a few hours later with their verdict. The jury had deliberated for approximately 3 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Charged with anticipation. Guilty. Guilty on both counts of murder. An audible gasp went through the courtroom. Brett Parker's daughter and other family members wept openly. The verdict was unanimous. The jury had not believed Brett's story. They'd looked at the evidence, listened to the testimony, considered the timeline and the forensics and the motive, and they'd concluded that Brett Parker had deliberately murdered both his wife and his business associate. Judge DeAndrea Benjamin wasted no time with sentencing. That same evening, she sentenced Brett Parker to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. In her courtroom, justice had been swift and decisive. For Tammy Jo's mother, Libby Carswell, the trial had been agonizing. She'd testified earlier about her daughter, about the family, about the bewildering horror of not knowing who to believe. I didn't see how Brian could do it, she'd said. I didn't see how Brett could do it. I could not believe either one could do such a thing. And so I was baffled, but the evidence had told its story. Tammy Jo Parker, 44 years old, who'd built a successful career and supported her family, had been murdered by her own husband. Not in a moment of rage or passion, but as part of a calculated plan to escape debt and collect insurance money. Brian Kapnerhurst, 46 years old, who'd spent 25 years working with young athletes, who'd once been a promising baseball player himself, had been murdered to eliminate both a creditor and a witness. He'd walked into that house worried about violence, and his fears had been entirely justified. Brett Parker would later attempt to appeal his conviction in 2016. A 3-judge panel reviewed the case and upheld the verdict. The evidence was solid. The conviction stood. As of today, Brett Parker remains incarcerated in a South Carolina prison, serving his 2 consecutive life sentences. The illegal gambling operation that had run through the Midlands, with Brett as its kingpin, was dismantled. At least 14 suspects were charged in connection with the betting ring. Brett's father, Jack Parker, faced federal charges for his role in the operation. The large house on Taqueria Court in Ascot Estates, where 2 people died on that April afternoon, eventually passed to other owners. New families moved in, unaware or unconcerned about the violence that had occurred within those walls. The neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm, children playing tennis courts, echoing with games, the community pool filling with swimmers in summer. Life went on, as it does in the suburbs of South Carolina. There's something about this case that lingers, something beyond the facts and the timeline and the forensic evidence. It's the gap between appearance and reality, between the life Brett Parker showed the world and the life he was actually living. To neighbors, he was a pharmaceutical sales rep, a father, a husband. Behind closed doors, he was running an illegal gambling empire, racking up debts he couldn't pay, having affairs, and ultimately plotting murder. It's the desperation that gambling addiction creates. The way it consumed both Brett and Brian, pulling them into a spiral of debt and bad decisions, creating tensions that ended in violence. It's the calculated coldness of the murders. If the prosecution's theory is correct, this wasn't a crime of passion. This was Brett methodically solving his problems with violence, eliminating the people who stood in the way of his financial escape, and then attempting to manipulate the criminal justice system with his staged self-defense story. It's also the small details that gave him away. The toilet seat that was up when it should have been down. The 11 minutes that were too brief for his story to be true. The gunpowder residue on window blinds that no one noticed for 43 days. The bullets with his fingerprints. The security camera footage that captured the timing of Brian's arrival. Murder investigations often hinge on such details. Tiny inconsistencies that seem insignificant in isolation, but that accumulate into an overwhelming weight of evidence. For Tammy Jo Parker's children, the trauma was compounded. Not only did they lose their mother to violence, but their father was the one who'd killed her. They had to sit through a trial where the terrible truth was laid bare. They had to grapple with the knowledge that the man they'd looked up to, the father who'd raised them, was capable of such calculated brutality. For Brian Kapnerhurst's family, his wife Cindy, his children, the young baseball players he'd coached, the loss was equally devastating. Brian had walked into that house despite his fears, perhaps hoping to resolve the debt peacefully, perhaps trusting that years of working alongside Brett meant something. He'd been wrong, and he'd paid for that trust with his life. In the end, Brett Parker's attempt to escape his problems through murder didn't work. The insurance money he'd hoped to collect never materialized. The debts he'd hoped to eliminate through violence still existed. And instead of freedom, he earned 2 life sentences. The house on Taqueria Court stands quiet now. The neighborhood of Ascot Estates continues its comfortable suburban existence. The tennis courts echo with serves and volleys. Children splash in the community pool. Sidewalks carry joggers and dog walkers through streets lined with mature trees and manicured lawns. But on April 13th, 2012, on a Friday that lived up to its superstitious reputation, 2 people died behind the brick facade of a nice house in a nice neighborhood. And the man who killed them learned that some debts can never be escaped. Some secrets eventually come to light. And justice, though sometimes slow, can be inexorable. And so we close this chapter, this journey into the hidden darkness behind suburban respectability. Let the story settle as you prepare for sleep. Remember that truth, like water, has a way of finding its way through cracks, of emerging despite attempts to bury it. Remember that appearances can deceive, that the smiling face of a neighbor might hide depths of desperation and darkness. Remember that violence, even when carefully staged, leaves traces that trained eyes can read. But most of all, as you drift towards sleep, remember that in the end, there were 2 victims. Tammy Jo Parker, who built a career and supported her family and deserved so much better than how her life ended, and Brian Kapnerhurst, who mentored children and loved baseball, and walked into danger despite his fears. They deserve justice. And justice eventually was served. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a story about a young woman whose light burned so bright that everyone who knew her couldn't help but be drawn to it. A story about dreams and ambition, about family and love, and about a system that failed when it mattered most. This is the story of Tiana Angelique Notice, and though it ends in tragedy, it's also a story about how one person's life, even when cut short, can spark change that echoes through time. We'll travel back to a cold February evening in Connecticut to understand not just what happened, but who Tiana was before that terrible Valentine's Day. Tiana Angelique Notice came into this world on February 4th, 1984 in Worcester, Massachusetts. From the very beginning, there was something special about her. Her father, Alvin Notice, and her mother, Kathy Lewis, recognized it early. By the time Tiana was 6 years old, her father would later recall, they already knew she was destined for remarkable things. Growing up between Gardner and Leominster, Massachusetts, Tiana was part of a blended family that wrapped her in love. She had 3 brothers, Christian, Tyrell, and Tyrone, a stepmother named Veronica, and a stepsister, Natasha. Her maternal grandmother, Angelita Santiago, doted on her, as did her paternal grandmother, Valeria Brown. Family gatherings filled her childhood with warmth, laughter, and the sound of music that Tiana loved so dearly. Music was Tiana's first language, in many ways. She sang in church choirs, her voice rising clear and true above the congregation. She wrote poetry that captured emotions with a maturity beyond her years. And she wasn't afraid to dream on paper, to imagine futures bright with possibility. Friends and family would later describe her as having a smile that could light up an entire room. The kind of presence that made you feel like everything might just turn out all right. But it wasn't just Tiana's warmth that made her exceptional. She possessed a fierce intelligence that set her apart from her peers. While other children struggled with their homework, Tiana excelled effortlessly. She read voraciously, argued passionately about ideas and principles, and showed an early interest in law and politics. Her mother, Kathy, noticed how much Tiana loved to debate, how she could take any side of an argument and defend it with logic and passion. "You should be a lawyer," Kathy would tell her. "You could argue with anyone and win." Tiana took that encouragement to heart. Her academic achievement was nothing short of extraordinary. She was so far ahead of her classmates that by the time she reached her senior year of high school, she was simultaneously completing her first year of college at Fitchburg State College. Imagine that for a moment. Finishing high school while already tackling college coursework. It was a testament, not just to her intelligence but to her work ethic, her determination to make something of herself. After graduating, Tiana set her sights on the University of Hartford in Connecticut. There she threw herself into her studies, earning a bachelor's degree in political science. But Tiana wasn't satisfied with just one degree. She wanted to make a real difference in the world, to have the tools and credentials to create change. So she enrolled in the University of Hartford's graduate program, pursuing a dual master's degree in public policy and communication, along with studies in paralegal work. In 2005, Tiana founded the Franklin D. Roosevelt chapter of the Roosevelt Institution at the University of Hartford, serving as its president through 2006. She was named to the National Dean's List. She did pro bono paralegal work that earned her awards and recognition. She was just 12 credits away from completing her master's degree when her life took an unexpected turn. By 2008, at 24 years old, Tiana was juggling her graduate studies with work, living in Plainville, Connecticut in a modest apartment complex at 40 Whiting Street. Her days were full: classes, studying, working, planning for a future that seemed limitless. But like many young women her age, Tiana also hoped to find companionship, someone to share her life with as she built her career. She had recently ended a 5-year relationship with her college sweetheart. The breakup was amicable, but it left Tiana feeling like she wanted to meet new people, to perhaps find someone who shared her ambitions and understood her drive. In 2008, online dating was still relatively new, but it offered opportunities to connect with people outside one's immediate social circle. That's how Tiana met James Carter II. James Carter II's online dating profile painted a picture of success. He was in his late 20s, and according to his profile, he owned his own home in Bloomfield, Connecticut. He claimed to work as an executive or manager at an insurance company. The details varied depending on who he was talking to. He presented himself as educated, financially stable, ambitious, and ready to settle down. On paper, he seemed like exactly the kind of person a young professional woman might want to meet. When Tiana and James connected, probably on MySpace or another dating site, depending on which account you follow, they arranged to meet in a public place. Tiana wasn't looking for anything too serious. She had just gotten out of a long-term relationship after all, but she was open to seeing where things might go. James was charming on that first date. He asked her about her studies, seemed impressed by her accomplishments, and talked about his own goals and dreams. Tiana's mother, Kathy Lewis, never met James in person during the early stages of their relationship. She only saw photographs of him that Tiana showed her. Years later, Kathy would recall that she had an immediate, visceral reaction to those photos. I immediately disliked him, she would say. You may want to call it mother's intuition. There was something about his eyes, his expression, that set off alarm bells in a mother's heart. But how do you tell your adult daughter, a brilliant graduate student capable of making her own decisions, that you have a bad feeling about her boyfriend based on nothing but instinct? Tiana's father, Alvin, had a different initial reaction. When Tiana told him about James, the details seemed reassuring. James owned his own home. He had a good job in finance or insurance. He seemed successful and stable. On the surface, James Carter II appeared to be a good match for Tiana. Someone who was building a life, someone with his life together. But surfaces can be deceiving. And the truth about James Carter II was far darker than anyone initially realized. The relationship progressed over the months of 2008. Tiana and James spent time together, went on dates, and began building what appeared to be a normal romantic relationship. But approximately 6 months into their time together, something happened that revealed who James really was. In mid-2008, James Carter II was arrested and sentenced to 5 months in jail. The crime? Domestic violence against a previous girlfriend. This was Tiana's first real glimpse behind James's carefully constructed facade. And as she dug deeper, asking questions and perhaps doing some research of her own, she discovered that James's criminal history didn't begin with that domestic violence arrest. He had multiple convictions for assault in 2002, 2006, and he had violated probation in 2008. The man she had been dating, the man who presented himself as successful and stable, was actually someone with a documented pattern of violence against women. For a young woman as intelligent and educated as Tiana, this information must have been devastating. She had been deceived. The person she thought she knew didn't exist. In his place was someone with a history of hurting the women he claimed to love. And there was more. Tiana began to suspect that James was cheating on her as well. Her father later shared that he believed James had been unfaithful during their relationship, adding betrayal to the growing list of reasons to end things. Tiana made a decision that probably saved her life in the short term, even though it ultimately put her in danger. She decided to end the relationship. In November or December of 2008, after about a year together, Tiana told James that it was over. She wanted nothing more to do with him. It was a clean break, or at least it should have been. But James Carter II was not the kind of man who accepted rejection gracefully. What happened next would consume the final months of Tiana Notice's life, and expose catastrophic failures in the very systems designed to protect women like her. After the breakup, James didn't disappear from Tiana's life. Instead, he became a constant, menacing presence. She would leave her apartment and see his car parked across the street. James sitting inside, watching. She would go grocery shopping and spot him following her through the aisles, maintaining just enough distance to claim coincidence. When she went out with friends, he would appear at the same places, his eyes tracking her every move. This wasn't the behavior of someone trying to win back a lost love. This was stalking, pure and simple, and Tiana knew it. She confronted James about his behavior, demanding that he leave her alone. James's response was to escalate in the most unexpected way possible. On January 4th, 2009, he went to the Plainville Police Department and filed a complaint against Tiana, claiming that she had assaulted and threatened him at her home. Think about the calculated nature of that move for a moment. Here was a man with multiple domestic violence convictions, a documented history of assaulting women, and he was accusing his ex-girlfriend, a graduate student with no criminal record, of threatening him. The Plainville police took his report, though their own notes indicated some skepticism about his claims. James's strategy became clear a few days later. On January 8, 2009, both James and Tiana appeared before a judge in New Britain. James was requesting a restraining order against Tiana. Tiana, recognizing the danger she was in, was requesting a restraining order against James. The hearing must have been surreal for Tiana. There she was, being accused of harassment by the man who had been stalking her for weeks. But she came prepared. Tiana brought printed copies of threatening emails James had been sending her. She had documentation. She had evidence. James, by contrast, had only his word in the police report he had filed. Despite this, the judge made a decision that seemed designed to be fair to both parties. He issued mutual restraining orders, each valid for 6 months. Both Tiana and James were ordered to stay away from each other, to refrain from threatening, harassing, stalking, assaulting, molesting, or attacking the other person. The judge specifically asked if they thought they might reconcile. "Do you think you could work things out and get back together next week?" Tiana's answer was clear and unambiguous. Absolutely not. For Tiana, the restraining order should have provided protection. It was a legal document signed by a judge that made it a criminal offense for James to contact her. If he violated it, police could arrest him. She must have felt some sense of relief walking out of that courthouse on January 8th. She had legal protection now. The system was supposed to keep her safe, but James Carter II had no intention of respecting that restraining order. And what followed over the next 5 weeks would expose just how little protection a piece of paper provides when the people charged with enforcing it fail to take threats seriously. The harassment began almost immediately after the restraining orders were issued. On January 13th, 2009, just 5 days after the court hearing, Tiana started receiving emails. They came from an address associated with someone named Jessica Bandera, supposedly one of James's ex-girlfriends. But Tiana recognized the writing style, the threats, the intimate knowledge of her life. She was certain James was behind them. The emails were vicious and threatening. They were designed to frighten her, to make her feel unsafe even in her own home. For 2 days straight, the emails kept coming, each one more hostile than the last. Tiana documented everything and went to the Waterbury Police Department, where she worked, to report the violation of the restraining order. The police response was disheartening. Without absolute proof that James was the one sending the emails, they told her there was nothing they could do. Never mind that the timing was suspicious, that the emails began just days after a restraining order was issued, that the contents suggested intimate knowledge of Tiana's life. Without proof, their hands were tied, or so they claimed. James meanwhile filed for another restraining order against Tiana on January 16th. Their scheduled follow-up court date. Both parties returned to court, and this time they were each granted 6-month restraining orders. The legal back and forth might seem confusing, but the pattern was becoming clear. James was using the legal system itself as a weapon, filing complaints and restraining orders to muddy the waters and make Tiana appear equally culpable in their conflict. Then, on January 31st, James went to the Plainville Police Department with a flyer. The flyer contained Tiana's photograph, her name, and her phone number. James claimed he had found it posted at his house, suggesting Tiana was harassing him. The police officer who took the report noted in his written statement that the claim seemed strange. Why would someone need to put their name and photo on a flyer sent to an ex-boyfriend who would obviously recognize them? It felt staged, manufactured. But the police investigated anyway, contacting Tiana, who vehemently denied having anything to do with the flyer. Throughout this period, James's stalking continued unabated. Tiana confided in friends that he was persistently bothering her. She would see his car outside her apartment at all hours. He would call and text constantly, despite the restraining order, explicitly forbidding contact. And Tiana did exactly what she was supposed to do. She reported every violation to the police. According to Tiana's mother, Kathy Lewis, her daughter went to police stations 33 times over a 6-week period between January and early February 2009. 33 times. Think about that. Imagine being so frightened, so desperate for help, that you go to the police more than once a day, every day, for weeks. Imagine documenting every violation, every threatening email, every unwanted phone call, every instance of your ex-boyfriend sitting outside your home in his car. And imagine being told that, again and again, that there was nothing the police could do. By early February 2009, the situation was escalating rapidly. James had apparently discovered that Tiana had reconnected with her college ex-boyfriend, and his harassment intensified. Then came the incident that should have been impossible to ignore. On February 7th, 1 week before she died, Tiana walked out to her car in her apartment complex's parking lot and found all 4 of her tires had been slashed. The damage was extensive, deliberate, and expensive. Tiana immediately suspected James. Who else would have done this? She reported it to the Plainville police, but once again she was told that without direct evidence, without proof that James was the one who vandalized her car, there was nothing they could do. It was classified as a property crime, not a violation of the restraining order. Frustrated and increasingly frightened, Tiana and her father Alvin took matters into their own hands. Alvin installed a wireless surveillance camera in the parking lot of Tiana's apartment complex, positioning it to capture anyone who approached her vehicle or her building. They figured if they couldn't get the police to take action, at least they would have evidence if anything else happened. The camera would later capture sounds that no father should ever have to hear. On February 13th, 2009, while Tiana was at work, she received a phone call. One of her coworkers answered, and immediately realized something was wrong. It was James calling, violating the restraining order. Yet again, this time Tiana had a witness. Someone else had heard James's voice, could verify the call happened. She contacted the Waterbury Police Department, where she worked, to report the violation. What happened next was a bureaucratic nightmare that perfectly illustrates how domestic violence victims can fall through the cracks of the legal system. The Waterbury officers told Tiana they couldn't verify the existence of her restraining order. It was a long holiday weekend, they explained, and they were short-staffed. They asked her to have the Plainville Police Department fax over a copy of the restraining order. Plainville was 18 miles away. Tiana had a copy of the restraining order in her possession. She showed it to the officers, but apparently that wasn't enough. There was confusion about how to authenticate the order, about where copies would be kept, about who had jurisdiction. The Connecticut Protection Order Registry existed precisely to prevent this kind of confusion, but somehow no one seemed able or willing to access it properly. Officer Victor Leon and Sergeant David Sheehan of the Waterbury Police Department would later be found negligent for their handling of this incident, but in the moment, Tiana was just desperate for someone to help her. When Tiana finally made it back to her apartment that evening around 7:20 p.m., she discovered another violation. Pinned to her door was a handwritten note from James. It read, "Tiana, forgive me. I never cheated on you. If I'm lying, may God take my life. Forgive me for everything else I have done." The surveillance camera Tiana's father had installed should have captured whoever left the note, but the tape had run out. Still, the note itself was evidence. Physical proof that James had been to her apartment in violation of the restraining order. Finally, it seemed the police might have to take action. On February 14th, 2009, Valentine's Day, Tiana went to the Plainville Police Department. It was a Saturday morning, and she brought everything with her. The note from her door, the emails James had sent the day before, including one that specifically said, "Please don't tell the cops about this," and her documentation of all the previous violations. She spoke with Officer Mark Connie and his supervisor, Sergeant Richard Marquez. She explained the escalating pattern of harassment, the constant violations of the restraining order, her fear for her safety. She told them about the slashed tires, about James sitting outside her apartment, about the phone calls and emails that never stopped. The officers told Tiana they would arrest James for violating the restraining order. They told her they would take care of it. Tiana left the police station that morning, believing, finally, that something was going to be done. She felt safe enough to make plans. She would stop by her apartment to pick up some clothes, and spend the weekend at her mother's house. She probably thought the worst was over, that the police were finally taking her seriously, that she could begin to reclaim her life. What Tiana didn't know was that the officers had no intention of arresting James Carter II that day. Instead, Officer Mark Connie did something inexplicable. Rather than going to arrest James for violating the restraining order, Officer Connie picked up the phone and called James directly. He told James that they had received a report about an email, and that if they found out James had sent it, he would be arrested. Think about what that phone call accomplished. In one conversation, Officer Connie told James that Tiana had gone to the police again, directly contradicting James's email that had explicitly warned her not to tell the cops. He told James that police were investigating, and critically, he gave James warning that he might be arrested, giving him time to prepare, to disappear, or to act. James Carter II chose to act. The sun was setting on Valentine's Day, 2009, as Tiana noticed drove back to her apartment at 4T Whiting Street in Plainville. She had been to the police station that morning. She had done everything right. She believed she was protected, that the system was finally working for her. She just needed to grab some clothes and she would head to her mother's house for the weekend. She had no way of knowing that James Carter II had spent the entire day plotting. Earlier that day, he had even attempted to hire a locksmith to get into her apartment. When that plan failed, James made a different decision. He would wait for Tiana to come home, and he armed himself with a knife. At 9:41 p.m., a call came into the 911 dispatch center. The caller was breathing hard, panicked, her voice tight with pain and terror. It was Tiana Notice. Her words would haunt everyone who heard them. "I'm bleeding to death. My ex-boyfriend just stabbed me to death." The surveillance camera Tiana's father had installed captured audio of the attack. Neighbors heard screaming, terrible, desperate screaming that echoed through the apartment complex. Witnesses saw a car speeding away from the scene immediately after the scream stopped. They would later identify it as James Carter II's vehicle. When police and paramedics arrived, they found Tiana in the parking lot. She had managed to run to get away from her attacker even as her life drained away from multiple stab wounds. The knife had found her body 18 to 20 times, depending on which account you read. One of those wounds had pierced her heart. Despite the massive trauma, Tiana had somehow maintained enough consciousness to call 911, to identify her attacker, to use her last moments to make sure the world knew who had done this to her. Paramedics rushed Tiana to Hartford Hospital, working frantically to save her life. But she had lost too much blood. The medical team tried everything. They even performed manual cardiac massage, literally massaging her heart with their hands, trying to force it to beat. But it was too late. At approximately 11:45 p.m. on February 14th, 2009, just 10 days after her 25th birthday, Tiana Angelique Notice was pronounced dead. When Tiana's parents Alvin and Kathy arrived at the hospital around midnight, they knew immediately from the receptionist's face that their daughter was gone. A surgeon led them to a private room and a team of doctors delivered the news. Kathy would later recall the doctor's words. "We did everything we could. We even did hand massage on her heart, but she had lost too much blood and we couldn't revive her. She's gone." Alvin Notice was taken to identify his daughter's body. Years later, during James Carter II's sentencing hearing, Alvin would describe what he saw. "I identified her body and I'll never forget what I saw. My daughter laying on a gurney all butchered up, less than an hour after Tiana died." Police arrested James Carter II. When they searched him, they found Tiana's blood on his shirt. They had witness statements placing his car at the scene. They had the surveillance camera audio capturing the attack. They had Tiana's own 911 call, her dying declaration naming James as her killer. And according to trial testimony, James's own brother would later testify that James had called him that night and confessed to stabbing Tiana. The evidence against James Carter II was overwhelming. There was never any real question about who killed Tiana Notice. The question was why the system had failed so catastrophically to prevent her murder. The legal proceedings that followed Tiana's death unfolded over several years, exposing the depth of the failures that had cost her life. James Carter II was charged with murder and violation of a restraining order. In February 2011, exactly 2 years after Tiana's death, he rejected a plea deal that would have sent him to prison for 45 years. He insisted on going to trial. His attorney, public defender Christopher Eddy, would later acknowledge that James had indeed killed Tiana. That fact was not in dispute. Instead, the defense strategy was to argue that James had been in a state of extreme emotional disturbance at the time of the murder, and therefore should be convicted of a lesser charge than murder. The trial took place in the fall of 2011. The jury heard the evidence, the restraining order violations, the threatening emails, the pattern of stalking and harassment. They listened to Tiana's desperate 911 call, heard the panic in her voice as she said she was bleeding to death. They heard testimony about James's prior domestic violence conviction, his history of assault charges, his pattern of violent behavior with women. On November 1st, 2011, after deliberations, the jury returned their verdicts: guilty of murder and guilty of violating a restraining order. James Carter II sat emotionless as the verdict was read. On January 13th, 2012, James Carter II appeared for sentencing before Judge Frank DiDeBabo. Tiana's parents had the opportunity to address the court. Kathy Lewis spoke through tears about the last months of her daughter's life, calling them horrendous as Tiana went from police station to station trying to get help. She described her daughter as a fine, beautiful, educated, intelligent, and articulate young lady and said that her heart would never be whole again until she was reunited with Tiana in heaven. Alvin Notice told the court about identifying his daughter's body, about the image that would never leave his mind. He expressed hope that James Carter would spend every day of his life in prison, thinking about what he had done, Judge DeBabo noted that James Carter had been looking directly at Tiana when he stabbed her repeatedly, had seen her face, had watched her die. But when it came time for sentencing, when it was time to face the consequences and look at Tiana's family, James refused to enter the courtroom. He chose to listen to the proceedings from a separate room, unable or unwilling to face the people whose lives he had destroyed. Judge Dadababo sentenced James Carter II to the maximum 60 years for the murder, plus a concurrent 5-year sentence for violating the restraining order. James Carter II, who was 31 years old at the time of sentencing, will be eligible for parole in February 2069 when he is 88 years old. He remains incarcerated at the McNeil Walker Correctional Institution in Suffield, Connecticut. But for Tiana's father, Alvin Notice, the criminal conviction was only part of the justice he sought. In 2011, before James Carter's trial had even concluded, Alvin filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the police departments that had failed to protect his daughter. He named officers from Plainville, Waterbury, and Bloomfield, arguing that their negligence had directly contributed to Tiana's death. The Connecticut Office of the Victim Advocate launched an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Tiana's murder, producing a detailed report that documented the failures at every level. The report was damning. It found that officers had dismissed Tiana's complaints, failed to properly authenticate her restraining order, hadn't understood the protocols for domestic violence cases, and had given James advance warning instead of arresting him. Most critically, the report noted that Sergeant McGrew of the Plainville Police Department had characterized the case as a routine violation of a restraining order. The report stated unequivocally a violation of a restraining order is never a routine matter. In April 2014, after a trial that lasted several weeks, a jury reached their verdict. They found that Officer Marconi and Sergeant Richard Marquez of the Plainville Police Department had been negligent in their handling of Tiana's complaints. They found that Officer Victor Leon and Sergeant David Sheehan of the Waterbury Police Department had also been negligent. The city of Waterbury had settled with Alvin Notice before the trial, but Plainville had chosen to fight the lawsuit. The jury awarded $10 million to Tiana's estate. Lawyers for the Plainville Police Department immediately announced they would appeal, arguing that the officers should be protected by governmental immunity. They described the situation as excruciatingly sympathetic, but claimed the officers couldn't be held liable for failing to predict the actions of a madman. But that framing missed the point entirely. No one expected the officers to predict the future or read James Carter's mind. What Tiana had needed was for officers to enforce the existing law. She needed them to take her complaints seriously. She needed them to arrest someone who was openly, repeatedly, violently violating a court order designed to protect her. She needed someone to see her as a human being in danger rather than as a routine complaint to be dismissed. She needed the system to work. And it didn't. In the aftermath of Tiana's murder, her father, Alvin Notice, channeled his grief into action. He established the Tiana Angelique Notice Foundation, dedicated to helping domestic violence victims and advocating for stronger protections for endangered women. Alvin became a tireless advocate for legislative change. He worked with lawmakers in both Connecticut and his home state of Massachusetts to pass stricter domestic violence laws. His efforts contributed to several significant legal reforms in Connecticut, including requiring police to arrest individuals who commit family violence crimes against someone they are dating, allowing electronic monitoring of domestic violence offenders through GPS tracking, expanding the list of crimes for which judges can issue criminal protective orders, requiring police departments to take domestic violence complaints more seriously, and providing better training on protection order enforcement. Alvin Notice installed surveillance cameras at the homes of domestic violence victims in Massachusetts, and sought volunteers to help with installations in Connecticut. He spoke at conferences, at police trainings, at community events, anywhere he could share Tiana's story and push for systemic change. Tiana's story aired on numerous true crime programs, including Investigation Discovery's Primal Instinct Murder on Camera, and episodes of 2020 and Nightline. Each retelling of her story kept the conversation alive about domestic violence, about the failures of law enforcement, about the importance of believing women when they say they're in danger. In August 2008, months before the relationship with James Carter fell apart, Tiana had written a poem titled Chapter Closed. Her father read it aloud at James Carter's sentencing hearing, and it stands as a haunting testament to Tiana's awareness that she needed to leave a dangerous situation. To prove he is who he says he is, I was disappointed. Let his emptiness comfort him at night. Like them cement walls he became accustomed to, I smile for my curtain call, for I regained my strength when I walked out the door. An empty house in solitude is how he will spend his days. And I rest assured in knowing I'm beautiful, smart, and on my way. Tiana knew her worth. She knew she deserved better. She had the strength to leave. She did everything right. She got a restraining order. She documented violations. She reported them to police. She sought help from the legal system that was supposed to protect her. And the system failed her. When Tianti Angelique Notice was laid to rest in February 2009, her obituary described a young woman who loved singing, poetry, and dancing, and mentioned her academic achievements, her bachelor's degree in political science, her near completion of a master's degree in public policy and communication and paralegal studies. It noted that she had founded the Roosevelt Institution chapter at the University of Hartford, that she was an honor student, that she had received awards for her pro bono paralegal work. But more than her achievements, people remembered Tiana's spirit. They remembered her smile that could light up a room. They remembered her kindness, her intelligence, her ambition. They remembered a young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, a woman who wanted to go to law school, who dreamed of making a difference in the world, who had so much to offer. Tiana's maternal grandmother was Angelita Santiago, and in her honor, the family established the Angelita Santiago Latino Scholarship Fund, ensuring that Tiana's memory would live on by helping other young people pursue their educational dreams. The case sparked important conversations about domestic violence, about how society and law enforcement respond to women in danger, about the gaps in the system that allow abusers to act with impunity even when protective orders are in place. Tiana's story became part of a larger movement to reform domestic violence laws and police procedures across the country. But beyond the statistics, beyond the legal reforms, beyond the headlines, Tiana Notice was a person. She was a daughter who called her parents regularly. She was a sister who laughed with her brothers. She was a friend who would drop everything to help someone she cared about. She was a student who stayed up late writing papers and studying for exams. She was a young woman who sang in church choirs and wrote poetry about her hopes and dreams. She was someone who loved life, who worked hard, who treated others with kindness and respect. She was someone who deserved to live, to finish her education, to have a career, to find real love with someone who would cherish her, to perhaps have children of her own someday, to grow old and gray and look back on a life well lived. James Carter II took all of that away on a cold February night. Motivated by nothing more than rage that Tiana had dared to leave him, that she had refused to be controlled, that she had chosen herself over his obsession. But Tiana's legacy extends far beyond the circumstances of her death. Through her father's advocacy, through the foundation that bears her name, through the legislative changes her story inspired, Tiana Notice continues to save lives. Every time a police officer takes a domestic violence complaint seriously because of revised training protocols, Tiana's voice echoes. Every time a woman fleeing an abusive relationship gets the help she needs because of strengthened protection laws, Tiana's legacy lives on. She deserved better from the system she trusted to protect her. We all deserve better, and the work continues. In Tiana's name, to make sure that no other bright young life is cut short because someone failed to take routine restraining order violations seriously. Tiana Angelique Notice, born February 4th, 1984, died February 14th, 2009, 25 years old, 12 credits from her master's degree, a whole lifetime of possibilities ahead of her, gone but never forgotten. Rest in peace, Tiana. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.